They set him up to fail. 5 coworkers, 1 joke, and a woman they thought would humiliate him the moment he opened his mouth. What they didn't count on was Nathan Brooks knowing exactly how to say hello. With his hands. In 60 seconds flat, their prank collapsed, and something neither of them planned for began growing in the ruins of someone else's cruelty. But here's what nobody tells you about connections built in broken places. They carry the weight of how they started. And sooner or later, the truth always walks through the door. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. The email came on a Thursday afternoon, buried between a Slack notification about a failed deployment and a calendar reminder for a sprint review nobody wanted to attend. Hey Brooks, free Saturday morning? We're all meeting up at Anchor and Grounds on 5th. Bring yourself. Skip the laptop. Nathan stared at it for a moment longer than he needed to. He wasn't antisocial. That was the thing people got wrong about him. They saw the quiet and assumed emptiness, assumed he was the kind of man who came home, microwaved something sad, and sat in darkness rewatching the same 3 shows on rotation. The truth was simpler and messier than that. He came home, made dinner from scratch because Lily had a thing about processed food since her kindergarten teacher showed the class a documentary about chicken nuggets, helped her with spelling words, read 2 chapters of whatever book they were going through together, and by the time she was asleep, he had maybe 40 minutes to himself before exhaustion made the decision for him. He was 32 years old, and his social calendar was built entirely around a 6-year-old's schedule. He'd made peace with that a long time ago. Still, he stared at the email. Marcus Webb had sent it. Marcus, who sat 3 desks down from him in the open plan office and had a laugh that could interrupt a conference call on the other side of the floor. Marcus was the social architect of their team, the guy who organized the fantasy football league, remembered everyone's birthdays, and had an opinion about every restaurant within a 4-block radius of their building. Nathan mostly liked him. He was the kind of person who made offices feel less like holding pens. Coffee. Just coffee. Lily's at your mom's this weekend anyway. That last part was true. His mother had been asking for months for a full weekend with Lily, and last week Nathan had finally caved, packed a bag with her favorite stuffed elephant and her special blanket that still smelled faintly of lavender from the last wash, and driven her across town. Lily had waved at him from the front porch without looking back. 6 years old and already better at goodbyes than he was. He typed back, "Sure. What time?" No, he almost canceled twice. Once on Friday night, when a bug he'd been chasing for 3 days suddenly revealed itself at 11:15 p.m., and he fixed it in under an hour, riding the specific high of that accomplishment that made him want to just work until morning. Once on Saturday morning, when he woke up to an apartment that was very quiet in the particular way that it only got when Lily wasn't in it, a silence with texture somehow, and found himself not wanting to fill it with strangers and forced conversation. But Marcus had texted him at 7:45 a.m. "You're still coming, right? Don't bail on me, Brooks. I've got something you need to see." Something he needed to see. Nathan had spent 15 years in software engineering developing an allergy to vague promises, but he went anyway, wearing the dark green sweater Lily had selected for him the last time they'd done laundry together, because, Daddy, it makes you look like a park, a compliment that still baffled and charmed him in equal measure. Anchor and Grounds was the kind of cafe that knew what it was. Not aggressively hip, not falsely rustic, just a good room with exposed brick, mismatched chairs, coffee that tasted like the person making it actually cared, and enough ambient noise to have a conversation without it feeling like a performance. Nathan had been there 3 or 4 times before, usually alone with his laptop, and liked it for those exact reasons. He spotted Marcus at a corner table, not the intimate kind, but the long rectangular one that coffee shops kept for group situations. There were 4 others already there. Priya Chandran from QA, who Nathan respected more than almost anyone in the building. Derek Holt, a back-end developer who had an impressive beard and an even more impressive capacity for saying absolutely nothing meaningful for hours at a stretch. Sandra Yee from Product, whom Nathan knew the least and who was scrolling her phone with practiced efficiency. And Kyle Reeves, who Nathan knew well enough to know he didn't particularly like. Something about Kyle's energy read as performative in a way Nathan couldn't fully articulate, like a man always slightly aware of an audience. "Brooks?" Marcus stood up as Nathan approached, clapping him on the shoulder with genuine warmth. Thought you were going to pull a disappearing act. Still might, Nathan said, but he sat down. The conversation was easy enough, the kind of low-stakes weekend chatter that didn't demand anything. They talked about the project they were all peripherally connected to, about a bar Marcus was obsessed with in Capitol Hill, about Priya's sister's wedding that everyone had been hearing about for months. Nathan ordered a black coffee and settled into it, and for a while it actually felt like a decent decision, coming here. Then Kyle leaned forward. He had the look of a man about to tell a story he'd been saving. So, Kyle said, real reason we're all here. He paused, which Nathan had learned was a Kyle signature, the dramatic beat before the reveal. There's someone else coming. Coming? Sandra looked up from her phone. I set something up. Kyle glanced at Marcus, who grinned in a way that Nathan couldn't quite read. There's this woman, Isabella. She's new to Seattle, moved here like 2 months ago, and she's... He paused again. Interesting. What does interesting mean? Priya asked, in the flat tone she used when she already smelled something wrong. She's a billionaire, Sandra said, not looking up. I looked her up. Isabella Sterling. Started 3 companies, sold 2, running the 3rd. Worth somewhere around $4 billion, depending on the day. Silence. Why is a billionaire coming to our coffee meeting? Nathan asked. Because she's looking to make connections here, Marcus said. She doesn't really know people in Seattle yet. My neighbor knows someone who knows her. It's like a 3-step chain. She agreed to come meet some people. Casual. And you thought we were the right people, Nathan said. I thought you were the right person, Kyle said, grinning now, the thing that had been waiting under his words finally surfacing. Come on, man. Single dad. Good job. Nice guy. You need this. I don't need a setup. Everyone needs a setup. I specifically don't. Brooks. Kyle leaned back. Just talk to her. What's the worst that happens? You have coffee with a billionaire on a Saturday? Life could be worse. Nathan looked at him, then at Marcus. Marcus was doing the thing where he wasn't quite meeting Nathan's eyes, which meant there was a layer to this Nathan hadn't found yet. He almost pressed it. Instead, he said, fine, and took a long drink of his coffee. Isabella Sterling arrived at 10:53. Nathan knew exactly when she walked in because the door opened and something about the room shifted. Not dramatically, not the way it happened in movies, but the specific low-level awareness that a new variable had entered the space. He looked up from the conversation he was half having with Priya about unit testing frameworks, and he saw her. She was not what he'd constructed in his head. The word billionaire carried a specific weight of image. He'd been picturing someone polished to the point of smoothness, the kind of person who looked like they'd been professionally assembled every morning. Someone who would make the mismatched chairs of Anchor and Grounds seem like a slight. Isabella Sterling walked in wearing dark jeans, a cream-colored knit sweater, and ankle boots that had seen actual use. Her hair was dark and pulled back, though not severely. More like she'd put it up with the vague intention of keeping it out of her face, and hadn't thought much past that. She was 30, maybe, with the kind of posture that came from confidence rather than performance. She was carrying a canvas tote bag. Not a designer one. Just a bag. She scanned the room with the particular alertness of someone who was always reading their environment slightly more carefully than most people needed to. And Nathan would not understand why until 1 minute later. Kyle stood up first, waving. She saw him, nodded, and moved toward the table. As she got closer, Nathan noticed something he hadn't caught from across the room. The small flesh-colored hearing aids, barely visible, curved behind each ear. And then he noticed Kyle glancing at him. That particular glance, the one with too much in it. Let's see how this goes, it said. This is the part where it gets funny. Nathan felt it hit him like cold water. Not the realization about Isabella. That landed cleanly, without any of the fluster the glance was expecting. The cold water was understanding what the glance meant, understanding what he'd been brought here for. But there was no time to unpack it, because Isabella Sterling was pulling out the empty chair across from him. Of course it was across from him. Kyle would have made sure of that. And sitting down and looking at him with dark eyes that were direct in a way he wasn't entirely prepared for. Kyle began speaking immediately, loudly and slowly, the way people did when they didn't understand that hearing aids existed as a technology in the 21st century. Isabella, this is Nathan. Nathan. Isabella. Isabella's eyes stayed on Nathan, and he understood why. She was lip-reading, and she didn't need Kyle's performance to do it. Something passed across her expression. Barely anything, the micro-compression of someone experienced at managing the particular exhaustion of being condescended to. Nathan put his coffee cup down. He looked at Isabella Sterling and brought his hands up and signed, "It's good to meet you. I'm Nathan. Sorry about my colleague. He clearly didn't get the memo that you don't need him to yell." The table went completely still. Isabella looked at his hands, then at his face. Then the corner of her mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile yet, but was clearly considering becoming one. She signed back, "How long have you known sign language?" "Since I was 8. My uncle is deaf. I grew up signing at family dinners." Her expression opened up then, not dramatically, but genuinely, the way a face changes when it stops being slightly guarded. She signed, "And does your colleague know that you know?" Nathan glanced at Kyle, who was staring at him with his mouth slightly open, all the shape of the planned moment completely wrong. He looked back at Isabella. "I'm starting to think that might be the whole point of this morning." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she laughed, a real one, a short burst of something caught off guard, and signed, "Well, this just got more interesting." Across the table, Kyle Reeves was doing math he hadn't planned to do. Marcus was trying not to look directly at anyone. Priya's expression had moved through several phases and settled somewhere around quiet satisfaction. Derek was examining his phone as if the screen had become suddenly fascinating. Sandra had looked up from hers and was watching Nathan and Isabella with an unreadable expression. Nobody said anything because there was nothing to say. The joke, whatever shape it had been designed to take, had collapsed in on itself in under 60 seconds. Where it had been, there was now just 2 people talking with their hands in a corner of a coffee shop on a Saturday morning, the rest of them rendered entirely beside the point. What Nathan had intended to be 45 minutes became 4 hours. He didn't plan it. Neither, apparently, did she. The rest of the group had filtered out by noon. Priya had given Nathan a long look when she left that he'd need to think about later, and Kyle had gone with something tightly controlled on his face that was trying to look like good humor and not quite making it. Marcus lingered the longest, catching Nathan's eye with an expression that was harder to read, part amusement, part something else, something that might have been close to guilt if you gave it time. But Nathan didn't give it time. He was in the middle of a conversation. The thing about talking with Isabella was that it moved differently than he was used to. Sign language had its own rhythm, its own economy. You learned to commit to a thought before you started expressing it, because half-formed gestures didn't carry the same ambiguity that half-formed sentences could hide behind. It made the conversation strangely honest. There was no filler, no trailing off, no verbal habits deployed to fill silence while your brain caught up. You thought, and then you said the thing. He'd forgotten that about signing. He'd grown up with it, had spent his childhood sitting across the dinner table from his Uncle Raymond, and some of the best conversations of his young life had happened without a single sound. Then Raymond had moved across the country, and Nathan's signing had rusted from disuse, and he'd lived the way most hearing people lived, surrounded by noise that didn't always mean anything. Sitting across from Isabella, he felt something shake loose. She was interesting in ways that had nothing to do with the number attached to her name. She was funny, dryly, quickly, the kind of funny that required you to be paying attention or you'd miss it. She had opinions she'd thought about and could defend without needing agreement. She was direct in a way that some people would call blunt and Nathan just called honest. When she didn't know something, she said so. When she disagreed, she said that too. "So the software you're building," she signed, "what actually happens if it ships late?" Nathan thought about the diplomatic answer and set it aside. "The contract has penalty clauses that kick in at 60 days. We're at 53. And your team knows that?" "The ones who need to." "Do you need more people or better processes?" He looked at her. "You cut right to it, don't you?" "I've sat in a lot of meetings where people talked for an hour to avoid answering that question," she signed. "It's either a resource problem or a communication problem. Usually both, but usually one is hiding behind the other." "Communication," he said after a moment. Definitely communication. She nodded with the look of someone who'd already known. He learned, over the course of those 4 hours, that she'd built her first company at 23 out of a problem she'd had personally: consumer software that was almost entirely inaccessible to deaf users, not from malice, but from the specific blindness of building for people who were exactly like yourself. She'd fixed it, sold the company at 27 for more money than she'd known how to think about at the time, and used the next 2 years to figure out what to do next. "Were you scared?" he signed. "When you sold it?" She tilted her head. "Of what?" "Of what came after, when the thing you built isn't yours anymore." She was quiet for a moment, the signing equivalent of choosing words carefully. "Yes," she finally signed. "I cried in my car in the parking lot of the lawyer's office, which I don't usually tell people." "Why tell me?" "Because you asked an honest question, and you looked like you actually wanted the answer." He sat with that. "What about you?" she signed. "Are you scared of things?" "All the time," he said. "Most of them have to do with my daughter." It was the first time he'd mentioned Lily, and he watched Isabella's face process it. Not with the particular recalibration he'd grown so familiar with, the one that said, "Oh, complicated situation," but with something more like attention. "How old?" she signed. 6. "She has very strong opinions about my wardrobe." He gestured at the sweater. This was her choice. Isabella looked at the sweater, then back at him. "She has good taste," she signed, and the frankness of it was so unexpected that he laughed. A real laugh, the kind that came from the chest without asking permission first. They were on their third coffee. His third, her second. She'd switched to tea at some point, when the topic of Seattle came up. "You moved 2 months ago," he signed. "How's it going?" She turned the cup in her hands. "Honestly?" "Please." "It's lonelier than I expected," she signed. "Which is embarrassing to say. I chose to move here. I knew people would be a slow build." She paused. "But I've been in cities before, and it was never quite like this. I think Seattle has a specific thing where people are friendly in a way that doesn't actually let you in." Nathan nodded slowly. "The Seattle freeze. Is that what it's called? People will be perfectly pleasant to you forever and never invite you anywhere." She looked at him. "Is that what you did today?" "I didn't know you 2 hours ago." "You didn't know me 80 minutes ago either, and somehow we're already talking about things I don't usually say out loud." He wasn't sure what to do with that, so he just said, "You're easy to talk to." "Ironically," she signed, with the particular humor of a deaf person making a joke about communication. He caught it, and the laugh surprised him again. Outside the window, Seattle was doing what Seattle did in September. Gray and silver and somehow still beautiful. The kind of day that required the city to argue its case differently. He'd lived here for 9 years and still found the light interesting in a way he couldn't fully explain to people from elsewhere. "Where are you from?" she signed. "Here, basically. Moved from Tacoma when I was 23. You?" "San Francisco. Before that, Boston. Before that, a town in Connecticut so small it doesn't have a Starbucks, which I mention only because I was told it was impossible. Why Seattle?" She looked at the window. "I wanted somewhere with enough room to be new," she signed. "San Francisco knows who I am. It has opinions about me. Seattle is still deciding." Nathan understood that more than she probably expected. He'd had a version of that himself. Not the Billionaire version, but the version that came after Lily's mother left when Lily was 11 months old, and he'd had to decide whether to be the person that story made him or a different person entirely. Seattle had given him room for the second option. He didn't know whether to tell her any of that. It felt like the right impulse, but the wrong moment. Instead, he signed, "Give it time. It'll come around." "Is that a promise?" "Call it a reasonable estimate." She smiled at that, a fuller one than the earlier almost smiles, and he noticed the small things that happened around it. The slight crinkle at the outer corner of her eyes, the way her shoulders dropped half an inch. He noticed these things, and then noticed himself noticing them, and that second noticing was its own information. He looked at his watch, 2:17 p.m. He'd been here for 3 hours and 24 minutes. "I should go," he signed, though his voice said something flatter than the words. Yeah. She glanced at the window, then back. This wasn't what I expected today. What did you expect? Honestly, awkward networking that everyone would agree was nice while quietly relieved it was over. And instead, she picked up her tea. Instead, I've been here since 11 talking to someone who thinks in very precise paragraphs and has a daughter who knows more about fashion than I do. She's 6. And yet, he pulled out his phone. The question sat in his chest for a moment before he decided to let it out. Can I get your number? So this isn't the only time we do this. Isabella looked at him for a moment. Not considering the question, he got the feeling the answer had already arrived. Just looking, the way people did when they were making a small decision about trust. She reached across the table and he handed her the phone. Nathan drove home in the particular state of a person whose Saturday had not gone the way they'd planned, in a direction that was harder to argue with than he wanted to admit. He parked outside his building and sat in the car for a few minutes longer than he needed to, which was a habit he'd picked up at some point in his late 20s that Lily had once observed with the terrifying accuracy of a small child. Why do you sit in the car, Daddy? Because sometimes the space between the outside world and the inside world needs a door in it, he'd told her. She'd thought about it and said like an airlock, which was both completely correct and the reason he was pretty sure she was going to be an engineer. He was halfway up the stairs to his apartment when his phone buzzed. Marcus. Hey, you okay? Nathan stopped on the landing. He typed back, I'm fine. What was that, Marcus? The 3 dots appeared and disappeared twice before Marcus responded. Kyle's idea. I should have said no. I'm sorry. Another buzz, before Nathan could respond. She was going to cancel when she found out you were all colleagues. Kyle told her it was just a casual friend group. He thought it would be funny, seeing you try to talk to someone who couldn't hear you. Nathan stood on the landing for a long time. The thing that lived in his chest when he was angry wasn't heat. It was something colder and steadier than that, a kind of deliberate stillness that he'd learned to recognize as the thing that preceded clarity. He typed, Did she know she was being used as a prop in a joke? The answer came after a pause. No, she didn't know any of it. Nathan put his phone in his pocket and went inside. He made himself dinner, the same pasta dish he'd been making since college, the one his mother had taught him before he left home, with the kind of method so absorbed into muscle memory that he barely had to think about it. He'd tried to make it fancier over the years, added things, changed things, looked up techniques, and eventually surrendered to the fact that the original version was simply the correct version, and that knowing something is right is usually more important than trying to improve it. He ate at the kitchen table with his phone face down. Then he turned it face up and found her name in his contacts. Isabella Sterling. She'd put her name in like that, first and last, formal, like a business card, which made him wonder if that was habit or armor, if the specificity of it was the equivalent of handing someone something that looked personal while keeping the actual personal parts hidden behind it. He thought about calling. He thought about what he would say. He thought about the fact that she'd walked into that cafe not knowing she was being watched by 5 people who expected her to be someone else's punchline. And he thought about how gracefully she'd handled the room regardless, and whether grace was the right word or if practice was the word, the kind that came from a lifetime of walking into rooms and doing the work of being someone people didn't quite know what to do with. He didn't call. Not that night. He put his phone on the charger, took a shower, and lay in bed with the particular quiet of an apartment without a 6-year-old in it, the one that had texture and weight, and eventually he slept. Sunday passed. Monday arrived with the specific cruelty of Mondays in crunch time. Nathan got to the office at 7:45, which was earlier than almost everyone, and worked through a problem he'd been avoiding because the solution required touching code in a module that 3 different people had written at 3 different times and nobody had documented adequately. He'd been putting it off. Today, he stopped putting it off. He was deep in it, really in it, the specific tunnel vision absorption of understanding something complicated. When Kyle Reeves appeared at the edge of his desk, Nathan kept his eyes on the screen. "Morning," Kyle said. "Morning." Kyle stood there for a moment. Nathan didn't look up. "Look," Kyle said. "About Saturday." "Not now, Kyle." "Brooks." I said, "Not now." He said it the same way he said everything when he was angry. Flat, quiet, with enough clarity that there was no ambiguity about whether it was a suggestion. Come back when I'm not in the middle of something. Kyle left. Nathan spent the rest of the morning working. At noon, he ate lunch at his desk. At 1 p.m., he messaged Marcus. Conference room, 10 minutes. Marcus was already there when he arrived, which told Nathan that Marcus had been expecting it. He came in and closed the door and sat down across from the same long rectangular table that conference rooms always had, and looked at Marcus for a long moment without speaking. I know, Marcus said. Tell me exactly what you knew and when. Marcus had the decency to not hedge it. He laid it out. Kyle had pitched the idea 2 weeks ago. Kyle had found out, through the 3-step chain, that Isabella Sterling was deaf, and had built the whole setup around the expectation that Nathan would sit down across from her and flounder. The obvious awkwardness of a hearing person unprepared for the encounter, amplified by the fact that Kyle had somehow discovered Nathan's particular hatred of awkward social situations and assumed it would perform on command. He didn't know about your uncle, Marcus said, obviously. I thought it would be, I don't know. I thought it would be funny in the moment, and then everyone would just have coffee, and it would be fine. She was the joke, Marcus, not me. She was the thing the joke was about. Marcus was quiet. She walked in there not knowing 5 people were waiting to watch her be an embarrassment to someone, Nathan said. She didn't know any of you. She came to meet people in a new city, and Kyle decided she was material. I know, Marcus said. Do you? Marcus met his eyes. Yeah, I do. I've been thinking about it since Saturday, and I know. He paused. I should have told Kyle no. I should have told you before you showed up. I didn't, and I'm sorry. I mean that. Nathan looked at him. Marcus was a lot of things, but he wasn't dishonest, and the apology had the shape of something real rather than something managed. Nathan let it land. I need you to make sure Kyle understands what he actually did, Nathan said. I don't care if it's uncomfortable. I'm going to have the same conversation with him, but it should come from you too. Marcus nodded. Agreed. And if anything like this comes up again, it won't, Marcus said. You have my word. Nathan stood up. At the door he paused. She's a good person, he said, which was not what he'd planned to say. He hadn't planned to say anything else at all. Marcus looked up. In case you were wondering, Nathan said, how the coffee went. And he walked out. He texted her that night. Nothing elaborate, nothing that was trying to be more than it was. Hey, it's Nathan from Saturday. I wanted to check in. I hope the rest of your weekend was good. He read it 4 times and sent it anyway. Her response came 40 minutes later. It was. I went to the farmer's market at Ballard and made an extremely ambitious soup that I then had to spend 3 hours eating because I completely misjudged the quantity. What about yours? He was smiling before he'd finished reading it. Mostly work and the particular silence of an apartment without my 6-year-old in it. She came back Sunday night. First thing she did was rearrange the magnets on the refrigerator because apparently I put them back wrong. Wrong how? All the colors were in the wrong quadrant. She's made a system. How long did it take you to understand the system? I don't understand the system. I've been told I don't need to understand it. I just need to not disturb it. There was a pause. Then, she sounds like someone I would absolutely take career advice from. He laughed. Alone in his apartment at 9:15 on a Monday night, he laughed at his phone like a teenager. He typed, "Would you want to get coffee again sometime or something else? I don't have a specific agenda." Another pause, shorter this time. I'd like that. No agendas. Just conversation. Saturday? Saturday. He put his phone down and looked at the ceiling of his apartment, where Lily had stuck approximately 11 glow-in-the-dark stars in what Nathan had initially assumed was a random pattern, but which Lily had once explained with great specificity was Orion's belt. 2 additional stars of unknown astronomical significance, and the rest are just because they looked good there. She was right. They looked good there. The week moved the way weeks moved when they contained something you were looking forward to. Not faster, exactly, but with a different quality of movement. Nathan noticed it and didn't examine it too closely. He'd learned, at some point in his early 30s, that the act of examining small good things usually involved dismantling them, and he'd had enough of that. He had the conversation with Kyle on Wednesday. It was not a long conversation. Nathan was not interested in long conversations about things that were clear. He sat down across from Kyle at a table in the break room, which he'd chosen because it had enough background noise to prevent an audience, and he said what he had to say without decoration. Kyle listened. His expression moved through several phases. The initial defensive posture, the recalculation, the thing underneath the recalculation that was harder to name. Not quite guilt. Something younger than guilt, maybe. Something that looked like a person confronting the gap between who they thought they were and what they'd actually done. "I didn't think it was that serious," Kyle said. "That's the part I want you to sit with," Nathan said. Kyle was quiet. "Not thinking it's serious," Nathan said, "is exactly how something like that happens. It doesn't require bad intentions. It just requires not thinking." He left Kyle with that. He didn't know if it would be enough. He wasn't sure that was his job to manage. Some things you said and walked away from, and the other person did whatever they were going to do with it, and you had to let that be their work to do. Friday night, Lily asked him why he was smiling at his phone. He was sitting at the kitchen table doing precisely that while she colored at the other end of it. She had a specific art project underway that she'd described as a landscape of feelings, which Nathan had decided to take at complete face value. "I'm just texting a friend," he said. She looked up. "What friend? Marcus?" "Not Marcus. Someone new." She studied him with the particular analysis that 6-year-olds performed when they suspected they were not being given the complete picture. "A girlfriend?" "A person I met last weekend." "That's not what I asked." He looked at his daughter. "When did you get this perceptive?" "Mrs. Patterson says I have strong observational skills," she said, and returned to her landscape of feelings. Nathan looked at his phone. Tomorrow, he'd texted Isabella an hour ago. "Same place?" Her answer had come in approximately 3 minutes. "Same place, 10 o'clock. I'm attempting to be on time, but I should warn you I have a complicated relationship with Saturday mornings." "How complicated?" "I own 3 alarm clocks and trust none of them." He'd smiled at that. He was still smiling at it, apparently. "Daddy," Lily said, without looking up, "your friend should come over for dinner sometime." "Why?" "Because the people you like should see where you live," she said, with the absolute conviction of someone who had worked this out independently and was confident in the conclusion. He looked at her. "Okay," he said. She nodded and selected a new crayon. The matter was settled. Saturday morning. Nathan got to Anchor and Grounds at 9:55. Isabella was already there. She was at a table near the window, a 2-person one this time, which felt like information, with a tea in front of her and her canvas tote on the chair beside her and her eyes on something outside. The morning light came through the glass and caught her from the left, and for a moment before she noticed him, he saw something in her face that he hadn't caught the week before. Something quieter than the energy she moved through rooms with. Not sad, just settled. Like a person who knew how to exist in a moment without needing to fill it. Then she looked up and saw him, and smiled. Not the almost smile from their first meeting, not the polite professional version, the real one. He crossed the room and sat down across from her, and before either of them could raise their hands to start talking, they both started at the same time, and had to stop, and she laughed and signed "you go," and he signed "no, you," and she shook her head and signed something that was approximately for the love of, and he laughed again, this easy, unexpected laugh that kept ambushing him when she was around, and the Saturday morning started. Neither of them knew yet what the week ahead would cost, but they were at the same table, and that was where it began. The second Saturday was easier than the first, which Nathan hadn't expected. He'd thought it would have the particular weight of a second attempt. The way second dates carried the pressure of confirming something the first one had only suggested. But it didn't feel like that. It felt more like picking up a conversation that had been briefly interrupted, the way it did sometimes with people you'd known a long time, except he'd known her exactly 7 days, and somehow the gap between last Saturday and this one had been less about distance and more about a door left open. She'd beaten him there, which she'd warned him about in the inverse. I have a complicated relationship with Saturday mornings, and he wondered if showing up early was actually her version of punctuality, the overcorrection of someone who'd spent a lifetime accounting for the extra seconds it took to navigate a world that wasn't built with her in mind. They ordered. She had the same tea. He tried to remember if he'd noticed that last week and decided he had, without knowing he was storing it. "How was your week?" he signed. "Long," she signed back. "I had 3 investor calls, and one of them kept forgetting I couldn't hear him, and then overcorrecting by typing into his phone and holding it up like I needed him to show me the words." "Did you say anything?" "I told him my phone could accept texts, and he looked personally betrayed by the information." Nathan shook his head slowly. "What do you even do with that?" "You keep the meeting short and you don't call him back," she signed, and something in her expression was matter-of-fact in the way of someone who'd made peace with a specific frustration by routing around it. Not bitterness exactly, more like the practiced efficiency of knowing which walls were worth trying to move and which ones you just walked the long way around. He thought about that for a moment. Does it get old, having to manage people like that? She looked at him. Not with offense, it was a real question, and she seemed to recognize it as one. "Yes," she signed. "But it's not the thing I think about most. The thing I think about most is the work." She paused. "The management is just weather. Some days worse than others." That's a useful way to frame it. "It took about 10 years to get there," she signed, with a dry honesty that he was starting to recognize as one of her signatures. He told her about his week in turn. The module problem he'd finally cracked, the code review that had gone sideways, the Thursday afternoon when Lily's school had called because she'd gotten into an argument with another first grader about whether sharks could live in rivers. And Lily had been so committed to her position that the teacher had to physically separate them. "Was she right?" Isabella signed. "About sharks?" "Mostly. Some species can. I had to look it up." So she was right and got in trouble for it. She was right, and she also wouldn't let it go, which is a different problem. Isabella considered this. Where does she get that from? Nathan kept his expression neutral. "Unknown." She gave him a look that said she found his neutrality unconvincing, and he laughed, and the morning stretched out ahead of them like something neither of them was in a hurry to finish. That was the second Saturday. The third was different because Lily came up more, not as a story Nathan was telling, but as a person Isabella was asking about. Specific questions, the kind that required him to actually think rather than reach for the standard parental highlights reel. What was she like when she was angry? How did she handle the hard stuff, the questions kids asked that adults never figured out how to answer? Did she know about her mother? That last one landed differently than the others. "Some of it," he signed. "She knows her mom lives somewhere else and that it was a grown-up decision that had nothing to do with her," which is the true version, just compressed. "How do you know when to give her more?" "I don't," he said. "I just try to make sure the door stays open so she can walk through it when she's ready." He looked at his coffee. "Some days I'm pretty sure I'm handling it wrong, and some days she comes home from school and tells me about her day like it's the best thing that happened to her, and I think, okay, we're okay." Isabella was watching him with the particular attention she had when she was really listening, which was different from polite listening in a way he'd started to notice. Something about the stillness of it. "You talk about her like she's already a whole person," she signed. "She is. Most people talk about their kids like they're projects." He thought about that. "She's not a project, she's just Lily." He paused. "She arrived as herself. I'm mostly just trying to keep up." Something moved in Isabella's expression that he couldn't quite name. Not pity, nothing close to that. Something that looked more like recognition. The way a face changed when someone said something you'd been thinking privately and hadn't expected to hear out loud. She looked down at her tea for a moment and then back up. "I think you're better at this than you let on," she signed. "At what?" "At knowing what matters." He didn't have an answer for that. He just held her gaze for a moment and nodded once, which felt like the most honest response he had. It was the third Saturday that he understood, without making a decision about it, that he was going to keep showing up. By the fourth Saturday, they'd moved outside because October in Seattle sometimes surrendered to warmth for a few hours in the middle of the day, a specific gift the city offered without warning. They walked along the waterfront, which required them to stop talking every few steps when one of them needed their hands for balance or a door or a coffee cup. And they adapted to it the way they adapted to most things, without discussing it, just working around the edges. Isabella had been in Seattle for 2.5 months by then, and the city was starting to take shape for her in the way places did when you stopped being a tourist in your own new life and started accumulating specifics. She had a coffee shop she liked better than Anchor and Grounds for mornings when she needed to work, a dry cleaner who'd figured out the best way to communicate with her and had stopped making it awkward, a neighborhood she walked through on weekday evenings when the work had gone long and she needed the specific reset that came from movement and air and other people's dogs. "I'm starting to know the rhythm of it," she told him that afternoon, her hands moving in the gray afternoon light. "I didn't think I would this fast." "Seattle rewards patience," Nathan said. "It just tests it first." "Like most things worth anything." He looked at her. She was watching a ferry move across the Sound, and the wind was doing something to the loose strands of her hair that she seemed entirely unaware of, and he had the strange, unguarded thought that he was going to remember this specific afternoon for a long time. The thought arrived before he could stop it, and sat there honestly. He did not say any of this. He kept walking. But the thought had arrived, and the thing about thoughts that arrived honestly was that they didn't unarrive. The conversations deepened the way deep things did, not with any single dramatic moment, but by accumulation. Layer by layer, each week adding something, not always a big thing, sometimes just a detail that told you who a person was in an unguarded moment. He learned that she was a light sleeper who'd spent most of her adult life making her environments controllable, because uncertainty while sleeping felt different when you couldn't hear. That she had a sister in Boston she called Shpi, texted, every Sunday, and that the sister was the only person in her life she didn't have to manage impressions with. That she had opinions about architecture that were detailed and specific, and not something she usually shared because people expected billionaires to have opinions about finance and strategy and were confused when the passion turned out to be structural engineering principles. "Why architecture?" he asked. "Because a building either works or it doesn't," she signed. "You can tell within 30 seconds of being in a space whether the person who designed it thought about the people who would use it. Most didn't. Some did." She paused. "It's the same problem I have with software, actually. Who built this, and did they build it for someone like me?" That connected something for him, a line between her first company and this conversation, a through line he hadn't fully seen before. "So everything you've built is about that," he said. "Who got left out of the original design?" She looked at him. "Yes," she signed. "Exactly that." He told her things in return, things he didn't typically lay out for people, not because he was secretive, but because most conversations didn't arrive at the place where they fit. He told her about the year after Lily's mother left, which had been the hardest year of his life, and also the year he'd figured out who he was when there was nothing comfortable left to lean on. He told her about his Uncle Raymond, who had been more of a consistent presence in his childhood than his own father, who traveled constantly for work and came home tired in a specific way that made him hard to reach. He told her that he'd learned to sign at 8 years old because Raymond had started coming to family dinners and Nathan had watched him navigate the room, the nodding and smiling and working so much harder than everyone else just to participate, and had decided with the specific moral clarity of an 8-year-old that this was wrong and fixable. "You taught yourself?" Isabella signed. "Raymond taught me. I just decided to learn." "There's a difference," she said. "Maybe. I wanted to talk to him. He was the most interesting person at those dinners by a wide margin." "What did you talk about?" "Everything. He was an electrician. He had opinions about how cities were wired that were legitimately fascinating. He taught me chess. He told me once that the most important thing in any room was knowing which walls were load-bearing and which ones you could take down." Nathan paused. "I think about that more than most things," he said. Isabella was quiet for a moment in the way she got when something was processing deeper than the surface. "Where is he now?" she signed. "Portland. We text. Not enough. It's one of those things I keep meaning to fix, and life keeps being life." He set his coffee down. "I should call him. He'd get a kick out of knowing I finally found someone worth signing with again." He said it without thinking, the way you said true things when you weren't being careful. And then he heard it land, in the sudden slight shift of the air between them, and he looked at her. She was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. Not guarded, not performing anything, just present, in a very direct and undefended way. "Sorry," he said. "That came out more—" She shook her head, a single clear motion. "Don't," she signed. "Don't apologize for saying something you mean." He held her gaze. "Okay," he said. It was not a big moment, on the surface. Two people at a table, coffee and tea, a Sunday afternoon in October. But something had been said that couldn't be unsaid, and it had been heard, and they both knew it. He didn't walk it back. She didn't make it complicated. They finished their coffee and kept talking until the light changed outside and the cafe started filling up with the Sunday afternoon crowd, and eventually they left because staying would have been clinging to something that had already become what it needed to be. Outside on the sidewalk, she pulled her coat tighter and looked up at the sky, which had resumed being Seattle gray with complete conviction. "Same time next week?" she signed. "Same time," he said. She nodded and turned and walked toward where she'd parked, and he stood there for a moment watching the direction she'd gone in the way you did when you weren't quite ready to start moving in your own direction yet. Then he did. It was the week after that fourth meeting, on a Tuesday, in the middle of a mundane afternoon, code on 3 monitors and a lukewarm cup of coffee going cold beside him. When Derek stopped by his desk with the particular energy of someone who had information and wasn't sure whether delivering it was a good or bad idea. "Hey," Derek said. Nathan looked up. "I heard you've been seeing that woman, the one from the coffee thing." "We've been meeting for coffee, yes." Derek scratched the back of his neck. "Look, I didn't think the whole thing with Kyle was cool, for what it's worth. I should have said that earlier." "Okay," Nathan said, "but there's something you should probably know." Derek glanced around the office with the furtiveness of someone who'd decided to tell you something and was already second-guessing it. "Kyle's been talking." Nathan's hands went still on the keyboard. "About what?" "About the setup. About how it didn't go the way he planned. He's been telling people, not everyone, but some people, the version where it's still kind of funny, like, can you believe Nathan actually knew sign language? What are the odds?" Derek paused. He's not saying anything bad about her exactly, but he's still telling the story. Nathan looked at his screen. The code sat there, patient and indifferent. "Does she know?" he asked. "How would she know? She's not in this office." "No," Nathan said quietly. "She doesn't know any of it." The thing in his chest that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite dread sat down and made itself at home. He'd been so focused on what Kyle had done, the action, the disrespect, the conversation he'd already had, that he hadn't fully reckoned with the part where Isabella still didn't know the whole truth. She knew they'd met through his coworkers. She didn't know that she'd been chosen because Kyle thought her deafness would be the punchline. She thought she'd been introduced to people as an equal. She'd walked into that cafe thinking she was meeting a friend group in a new city. She had been, in the cleanest technical sense, set up, not romantically, but instrumentally, as a piece in someone else's joke. And Nathan, who had walked away from that first morning feeling like something genuinely good had started, had been so careful about confronting Kyle and Marcus, and not quite careful enough about confronting the fact that the foundation this thing was built on had a crack in it that Isabella didn't know about. She deserved to know. The thought arrived without drama, the way certain things arrived when they were simply true. Not as a decision he was wrestling with, as a fact he was accepting. He just had to figure out how. He spent 3 days sitting with it, not avoiding, sitting with it, which was different, turning it over, thinking about what to say and what it might cost. He knew that telling her risked something real, not because he'd done anything wrong, but because the story contained a cruelty she hadn't been protected from, and delivering that information meant making her experience it retroactively. There was no version of the truth that didn't require her to go back to that first morning and understand it differently. He thought about what she'd said about the investor who held his phone up like she needed to see the words, about the particular exhaustion of people who managed her as a problem rather than engaging with her as a person, about walking into a new city and trying to build something honest from scratch. And then he thought about sitting across from her every Saturday and letting her laugh at his stories and share things she didn't usually say out loud, all while knowing that the origin of the whole thing was something she'd been kept from. He texted her on Thursday evening. "Can we meet this weekend? Not coffee. Maybe lunch. I have something I need to tell you, and I want to do it properly." She read it. He could see. The 3 dots appeared. That's either very good or very bad. It's neither, I think. It's just honest. A pause. Okay. Saturday. Same cafe? Same cafe. He put his phone down and looked at Lily, who was lying on the living room floor doing homework with her shoes still on because taking them off required a pause she hadn't been willing to commit to yet, and he thought about what she'd said weeks ago. The people you like should see where you live. Simple. True in the way 6-year-olds were sometimes true without knowing they were being profound. He'd been showing Isabella where he lived, figuratively, for a month of Saturdays. It was time to show her the whole floor plan, including the part he hadn't gotten to yet. Saturday arrived the way Saturdays did when you were anxious about them. Too fast, and also somehow too slow, the week both dragging and collapsing. He got there early again. He was already on his second glass of water when she walked in. She sat down and looked at him with those direct dark eyes, and he noticed she'd picked up on his energy immediately, the way she always did. She read a room through a combination of visual cues and practice that made her better at it than most hearing people he knew. "You look like you slept badly," she signed. "Little bit," he admitted. "Tell me." He'd thought about how to start this at least 40 times across the week. He'd drafted it in his head and discarded the draft and started over. In the end, he started the only way that felt right, which was at the beginning. He told her everything. Not the sanitized version, not the one where Kyle's intentions were vague or where Marcus's role was minimized. The real version. He told her that Kyle had specifically chosen her because she was deaf, that the joke had been designed around the expectation of Nathan's failure, that he'd walked into that cafe without knowing he was being watched for entertainment. He told her that Marcus had known and hadn't stopped it. He told her that he'd found out afterward, and that he'd confronted both of them, and that he'd spent 3 days deciding whether to tell her because he'd been afraid of what it might do to the thing they'd been building. He told her that last part deliberately. It was the part that admitted the most about how much this mattered to him, and he put it out there anyway, because leaving it out would have been its own small dishonesty. When he was done, he put his hands in his lap and waited. Isabella was still. Not the reading the room stillness. This was something different. This was the particular stillness of someone whose interior landscape had just been rearranged and who was deciding how to move through it. She looked at the window, then at the table, then at him. "The person who set it up," she signed. "Kyle. Did he think it was funny after?" "He was still telling the story last week. I found out through someone else. That's partly why I needed to tell you now." She nodded once, slowly. "And you," she signed, "when you found out, right at the beginning, you thought about leaving." It wasn't an accusation. It was a clarification, making sure she had the shape of it right. "Briefly," he said, "not because of you, because I was angry and the situation was complicated and I didn't know how to be in it cleanly." "But you stayed." "I wanted to stay more than I wanted to solve the complication." She looked at him for a long moment. He let her look. He didn't try to fill the silence with reassurance, because she hadn't asked for reassurance. She was processing, and processing required space, and the least he could do was give it. "I'm not angry at you," she signed finally. "You can be." "I know I can be. I'm telling you I'm not." She paused. "I'm angry at him. At both of them. What they did was, it was reducing me to a prop in something I didn't consent to be part of. And that's a specific kind of thing. It has a specific kind of sting." "I know." "You don't know exactly," she signed without heat, "but you understand it better than most." He accepted the distinction. It was accurate. "The thing is," she continued, and her hands slowed slightly, the signing equivalent of choosing every word carefully. "From the first moment you sat down, you treated me like a person, not a situation, not a challenge, just someone you were meeting." She looked at her tea. I've been in enough rooms to know the difference, and I knew it that day, which is why I stayed. He was quiet. The fact that the room was also a setup doesn't change what happened in it, she signed. It just makes me angrier at the people who arranged it. She looked up. Which I'm going to sit with for a while. That's fair. And I appreciate that you told me. She signed it simply, without making it bigger than it was. You didn't have to. You could have carried it, and I never would have known. The fact that you didn't do that, that matters. Something in Nathan's chest eased in a way it had been waiting to ease all week. I didn't want anything between us to be something I'd decided for you, he said. You should have had the information from the beginning. I'm sorry that you didn't. She nodded. They sat with it for a moment, the information settling between them like sediment, finding its level. Then she signed. So, now I know. Now you know. And we're still sitting here. He looked at her. We are. Then I think, she signed, picking up her tea, that we should order real food. I've been hungry for 20 minutes, and I didn't want to interrupt the serious part. He blinked. Then he laughed. The real kind, the unexpected kind, and picked up the menu and flagged down the person behind the counter, and outside the October sky did something complicated with the light that made the whole street look briefly silver, and neither of them remarked on it, but both of them noticed. The afternoon stretched out from there in a different way than the mornings had. Longer, more sprawling, the kind of time that didn't have a shape it was trying to maintain. They ordered sandwiches. He got a second coffee. She told him about the new business she was building in Seattle, a platform connecting deaf and hard-of-hearing professionals with companies genuinely committed to accessibility, not the performative kind, she was specific about that, but companies that wanted structural change and needed help knowing how to build it. How do you tell the difference, he asked, between genuine and performative? You ask them to change something concrete and you watch how long the conversation takes, she signed. If they need 12 meetings to decide to caption their internal videos, they're performative. If they ask what else they've missed, they're genuine. Simple. Most important things are, once you stop complicating them. He thought about that. He thought about 8-year-old Nathan deciding to learn sign language because the math had been simple. Raymond was at the table and Nathan wanted to talk to him, so Nathan would learn. He thought about Lily rearranging the refrigerator magnets with the complete confidence of someone who knew what order looked like and wasn't going to settle for less. Some things really were simple. The complications were usually introduced later by people who had reasons to make them complicated. He told her that, the condensed version, and she listened with her hands in her lap and her eyes on his face, and when he finished, she signed, Your daughter is going to be formidable. She already is, he said. You sound terrified. Constantly. In the best way. She smiled. Not the polite version or the full one, but something in between, something easy and specific, like the kind of smile that appeared when you weren't performing happiness but just feeling it on a cellular level. He noticed it and stored it in the same place he'd stored the fairy and the silver light. They left at 3 because the cafe needed the table, and they'd been there long enough that it was simply the right time. Outside on the sidewalk, the air was cold in the honest October way, and their breath made small clouds, and they stood there for a moment in that particular indecision of a goodbye that nobody wants to rush. For what it's worth, Isabella signed, her hands visible between them in the cold air. I'm glad the coffee thing happened, even knowing what I know now. Yeah? The prank failed, she signed, which means the person who designed it didn't get what he wanted, and the thing that happened instead, she looked at him. I'd take that trade every time. He held her gaze. Me too, he said. She nodded once, the clean, decisive nod he'd started to recognize as her period at the end of a sentence, and pulled her coat closer and turned toward the street. He watched her go. Then he turned in his own direction and walked, and the city moved around him in its Saturday afternoon way, and he thought about load-bearing walls and which ones you could take down, and what it felt like to make a room bigger than it used to be. He thought he might call Raymond tonight. It had been too long. He called Raymond that night. It was almost 9 o'clock, which was late enough that he almost talked himself out of it. But Raymond had always been a night person, the kind who did his best thinking after dark, who'd once told Nathan that silence felt different at night, more chosen somehow, less like an absence and more like a preference. Nathan had been maybe 12 when Raymond said that, and he hadn't fully understood it then, but he'd filed it somewhere and pulled it out over the years, and each time it made a little more sense. Raymond answered by video because that was the only way he answered, and his face appeared on the screen looking exactly like Nathan remembered, and also slightly older in the way faces did when you saw them in motion after a long gap. The still photos you exchanged over text didn't capture the movement, and movement was where age actually lived. Raymond signed, Nathan. It's been a while. I know, Nathan signed back. I'm sorry about that. Don't apologize. You have a daughter and a career. I'm retired and I have a cat. The math is obvious. He settled back in his chair. How's Lily? Formidable, Nathan signed, using the same word Isabella had used that afternoon, and something about the repetition of it across a single day felt right. She reorganized my refrigerator magnets. Good for her, Raymond signed, and his expression was the one that Nathan had loved his whole life. The dry warmth of a man who found the world genuinely amusing without being unkind about it. What's going on? You don't call at 9 p.m. for the magnets. Nathan smiled. No. I met someone. Raymond's eyebrows moved. Someone. She's deaf. Profoundly. Since birth. He paused. She's also... He reached for the right sign and settled on significant. I think. I'm still figuring that out. Raymond was quiet for a moment in the way he got when he was processing something with his full attention rather than just the surface of it. How did you meet? Nathan told him. The short version, but the real one. Raymond listened without interrupting, which was something Nathan had always valued about him. The ability to hold space for a story without inserting himself into it prematurely. When Nathan finished, Raymond's expression had moved through several things and arrived somewhere thoughtful. The coworker, Raymond signed. The one who set it up. He thought it would be funny. Yes, because he assumed you'd be useless with her. Yes. Raymond looked at him for a long moment. Then he signed. I've been in rooms like that my whole life, rooms where someone thought my being there was funny. He said it without self-pity, just the flatness of a fact that had been lived with for so long it had stopped needing commentary. What I notice is that you didn't walk away from her. I thought about it, Nathan admitted. But you didn't. No. Good, Raymond signed simply. Tell me about her. So Nathan did. He talked for 20 minutes, longer than he'd intended, and Raymond listened and occasionally asked questions, sharp ones, the kind that required Nathan to think rather than just continue talking. What did she build, and why? How did she handle the parts of the world that weren't built for her? What did she think was important? Nathan answered each one, and noticed as he did that he had actual answers, not approximations, because he'd been paying attention across 5 weeks of Saturday mornings and one afternoon that had lasted until 3 o'clock. When he finished, Raymond signed, You like her? Yes. Not just the situation, not just the novelty. Her. Yes. Raymond nodded slowly. Then don't make it complicated. Be straightforward. Deaf people, he signed, and there was something both personal and general in it, have usually had to work twice as hard to be understood as who they are rather than what they can't do. The most valuable thing you can give someone like that is the experience of being known plainly. Nathan thought about what Isabella had said earlier. You treated me like a person, not a situation. He thought about how she'd said it without making it a compliment exactly, more like a baseline observation, like noting that a room had windows. I'm trying, he signed. I can tell, Raymond signed back. Or you wouldn't have called me at 9 p.m. to talk about her. He stayed on with Raymond for another half hour, during which they covered Raymond's cat, a fence dispute with his neighbor that had been ongoing for 8 months, and the chess opening Raymond had been studying that he claimed was going to change the way Nathan thought about early game positioning, even though Nathan hadn't played in 2 years, and Raymond knew this. It was the best conversation he'd had in a long time, and when he hung up, he sat in the quiet of his apartment and thought about how strange it was that one afternoon had shaken loose so much. Isabella and Raymond in the same day, the same conversation in a sense, the same theme, if he was being honest about it. What it meant to see someone properly, what it cost not to. He went to bed thinking about that. He didn't sleep great, but for different reasons than the week before. The weeks that followed had a shape to them that Nathan hadn't had in his life for a long time, or maybe ever in quite this way. He and Lily settled into their rhythms, the school runs and the dinners and the Sunday afternoons that belonged entirely to them, and threaded through it was this other thing, the Saturday thing, which had started as coffee and expanded without anyone formally deciding to expand it. The fifth Saturday, they walked through Pike Place Market because Isabella said she'd been meaning to for weeks and kept not going alone, and she wanted to know what Nathan thought it was like versus the tourist version she'd read about. He told her the tourist version was real. It just coexisted with the local version, which was more about specific vendors and specific produce and knowing which fish you actually wanted versus which fish was performing. She found this distinction funnier than he expected, and he realized he'd been making an earnest case for fish selection philosophy, which was also funny in retrospect. They ate lunch standing up at a counter inside the market, which required one-handed signing and creative use of elbows, and they managed it with a grace that was less elegant than functional, which seemed like the correct approach. She told him about the first hire she'd made for the new company. A woman named Teresa, who was hard of hearing and had spent 15 years in HR at companies that had never once asked for her perspective on accessibility, which Teresa had found so enraging and so clarifying that she'd become the most efficient architect of equitable hiring processes that Isabella had encountered. She walked into the interview and told me everything I was doing wrong before I'd asked her a single question, Isabella signed. I hired her on the spot. How many things were you doing wrong? 4 structural things and 2 things that were just inefficient. She was right about all of it. And you weren't defensive? Isabella gave him a look. I called her in specifically because I wanted someone who would tell me what I was missing. Being defensive would have been a waste of both our time. He nodded. He was thinking about what it looked like to build something the right way from the start, and how rare that actually was. The willingness to be corrected before the mistake compounded. I want to show you something, she signed and pulled out her phone and opened a document that was a kind of early prototype. Not software yet, more of a design document, the shape of the thing before the thing existed. She handed him the phone, and he read through it while she finished her food, and what he found was a system that was, at its core, elegant in the way Raymond's chess openings were elegant. It solved the actual problem, rather than a version of the problem that was easier to solve. He handed the phone back. This is good, he said. I know, she signed, without false modesty. I'm telling you because you understand systems, and I wanted to know if the logic held. The logic holds. The onboarding flow has a gap in the middle, but the core architecture is solid. Where's the gap? He took the phone back and showed her. She looked at it, frowned, took the phone back, typed something, handed it to him. He read. He shook his head, typed his counterpoint. She read. The frown deepened, then cleared, replaced by the expression she got when something settled into place. They had the entire conversation on one phone, typing back and forth, standing in the middle of Pike Place Market, while the noise of the place moved around them, and it was the most efficient design conversation he'd had in months. No meetings, no slide decks, just a problem and 2 people who could see it clearly and weren't interested in anything other than solving it. You should come see the actual office sometime, she signed. I'd like your read on the tech setup. We're building the infrastructure from scratch, and I think there are decisions being made that will cost us later. I'm not an infrastructure specialist. No, but you think about problems the way I need someone to think about them, which matters more than specialty in the early stage. He considered that. When? Whenever you're not drowning. So never, but I can probably surface for a few hours on a Thursday. She smiled. Thursday, then? He went on a Thursday. The office was in South Lake Union, in one of those buildings that had been industrial once and been converted with enough care that it retained the bones of what it had been while functioning as what it was now. He appreciated that about it before he even got inside. He thought about what Isabella had said about architecture. A building either works or it doesn't. And this one worked. Teresa met him at the front, a woman in her mid-40s with efficient posture and the particular energy of someone who had a lot to do and had accepted this as her natural state. She was hearing but fluent in ASL, which she deployed immediately and without the performance of a person demonstrating a skill. She was just using the language of the room, which was the correct approach. The team was small, 9 people, mixed hearing and deaf and hard of hearing, which was by design rather than coincidence. Isabella walked him through the space with the particular ownership of someone who'd built something from a floor plan and a belief, and he listened and looked and asked questions the same way he'd read her design document, looking for where the logic held and where it didn't. The tech setup was good in some areas and had the specific problems that early-stage companies always had. Decisions made under time pressure that had since become load-bearing. Infrastructure choices that reflected what was available rather than what was right. A data architecture that was going to require a significant rebuild somewhere around the 18-month mark. He told her all of this, standing in the server room with both of them in their coats because the temperature was maintained for machines rather than people. How bad is the data architecture? She signed. Not catastrophic, but it'll cost you 6 to 8 weeks when you hit scale. What would you do? He thought about it. I'd want to look at it properly before I told you anything specific, but the basic answer is that you want to make the expensive decision now rather than later. The rebuild is going to happen either way. The question is whether you control the timing. She nodded slowly, processing. Could you look at it properly? She signed. Not as a consultant, just as someone who looks at it. You mean someone who gives you 40 hours of specialized thinking for free? I mean someone whose opinion I trust and who might find it interesting. She paused. I'm not asking for a favor. I'm asking if you're curious about the problem. He was the thing. He'd been curious about it since he read the document at Pike Place, and the walkthrough had made it more interesting rather than less. It was the kind of problem that had a clean solution if you approached it right, and finding clean solutions to messy systems was the part of his work he still found genuinely engaging after 15 years. I'm curious about the problem, he said. Then come back when you have time. No agenda. We'll just look at it. He came back 2 Thursdays later, and then a third time. The data architecture problem turned out to be connected to 2 other problems, as infrastructure problems usually were, and the untangling of it was satisfying in the specific way that complex puzzles were satisfying when the solution revealed something elegant underneath the mess. But the Thursdays were also something else. They were Nathan in Isabella's world, seeing how she moved through it, different from the Saturday mornings, which had always been a neutral space between their separate lives. Here she was at work, and at work she was direct and decisive in a way that was striking even knowing her. She ran a meeting. She ran it by letting everyone see her hands, and by having captioning on the screen at the front that an AI service updated in near real time, and by structuring the discussion so that input came in turns that everyone could follow. And the meeting was 40 minutes long and ended with clear outcomes and zero ambiguity about next steps. He'd sat through 1,000 meetings in his career. He could count on one hand the number that had looked like that. You run a tight meeting, he told her afterward. Wasted time in a meeting costs everyone twice, she signed. Once while it's happening and once in the work that doesn't get done. I stopped tolerating it after my first company. How do you keep people from resenting the structure? I make sure they know why the structure exists. People don't resent efficiency. They resent being managed without explanation. She looked at him. Also, I notice when people are struggling and I ask them directly rather than hoping it surfaces on its own. Most resentment is just unexpressed confusion. He thought about his own team, about the code review that had gone sideways in September, and whether he'd asked the right questions afterward, or just assumed. That's going to make me better at my job, he said. You're already good at your job, she signed. I can be better. Yes, she agreed, without the false protest that you're already great that most people would have offered. She just agreed, because it was true, and they both knew it, and pretending otherwise would have been slightly insulting. He realized, going to have to get used to the specific experience of being around someone who didn't soften true things. He was finding that he didn't mind it at all. The thing that was building between them had not been named. This was a fact they were both aware of and had not addressed directly, which was itself a choice, the way not saying something was always a choice rather than an absence of one. Nathan thought about it and decided that the not naming was appropriate. Not avoidance, but pacing, the way you didn't run across uncertain ground. You moved across it carefully, and you looked at where you were putting your feet, and you trusted that the other person was doing the same. But outside forces, as they tended to, were developing opinions about the timeline. It started at work on a Wednesday in mid-November, which was 5 weeks after the Saturday at Anchor and Grounds, where he told her the truth. He was at his desk when he became aware, in the peripheral way of open-plan offices, that Kyle Reeves was having a conversation at the edge of the kitchen area that was a few decibels too loud to be private. Nathan didn't look up. He'd developed a practice of not looking up at Kyle unless he specifically needed to, which was an effective system. But then he heard Isabella's name, not clearly enough to catch everything, enough to catch the shape of it, the particular conversational register of someone telling a story they found entertaining, the way laughter punctuated it. And then the name. And then something Nathan couldn't quite make out, but which landed with the weight of something specific. He looked up. Kyle was with two people Nathan didn't know well, contractors who'd been with the team for about 6 weeks, knew enough to still be forming their understanding of the office's social architecture. Kyle had the posture of a man enjoying himself. The contractors were laughing in the uncertain way people laughed when they weren't sure if something was funny or just being framed as funny by someone whose approval they wanted. Nathan looked back at his screen. He thought about the conversation he'd had with Kyle in the break room, the one he'd believed had landed, the one Kyle had sat through with the expression of a person absorbing a consequence. He thought about Derek telling him Kyle was still telling the story. He thought about the contractors, who would go back to their teams somewhere in the city with a version of a story about a real person. He sat at his desk for 11 minutes without doing anything particularly useful. Then he got up, went to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water he didn't need, and when Kyle saw him and the laugh slightly faltered, Nathan looked at him with a steadiness he didn't have to manufacture because the anger was cold, and cold things were always steady. He didn't say anything in the kitchen. He went back to his desk, and he sent Marcus a message. "Kyle is still doing it. I can hear it from my desk." Marcus responded within 3 minutes. "I'll handle it. What does that mean?" "It means I'm going to HR today. I should have done it a month ago. I've been giving him the benefit of the doubt, and he hasn't earned it." Nathan read that twice. "Okay," he sent back. "For what it's worth," Marcus added after a pause, "I've been carrying this wrong. I should have been clearer with him from the start about what it was going to cost him if he kept going. I kept hoping he'd get there himself. He hasn't. People don't always get there themselves." "Yeah, I know that now." Another pause. "How's she doing?" "Isabella." Nathan considered how to answer that. "She's building something real," he typed finally. "She's doing well." "Good," Marcus sent back. "I'm glad it turned into something. I mean that." Nathan closed the thread. He got through the rest of the day. He picked Lily up from after-school care, and she informed him on the walk to the car that she had a best friend situation that was complicated and she needed to talk it through. He said okay, and they went home and he made dinner, and she talked through it while sitting on the counter watching him cook, something she was theoretically not allowed to do, but which he'd stopped enforcing because it was where the best conversations happened, and some rules mattered more than others. The situation turned out to involve a disagreement about whether a particular game was fair and who had started the unfairness. Nathan listened to the whole thing and asked questions and refrained from offering solutions until she asked for them, which she did, eventually, after working through most of it herself. "What do you think I should do?" she said. "I think you know," he said. She thought about it. "Tell her it wasn't fair, but that I still want to be her friend?" "That sounds right to me." "What if she doesn't want to be friends anymore?" He looked at her. "Then that's going to hurt. But you'll know you were honest, and the friendships you keep by being honest are worth more than the ones you keep by pretending things are fine when they're not." She chewed on this for a moment with the focused expression she used when she was taking something seriously. "Okay," she said, and slid off the counter in one motion and went to set the table, and the conversation was over, which was very Lily. She didn't need to drag things out once she'd reached a conclusion. Nathan stood at the stove and thought about honesty and what it cost and what it preserved and how much easier it was to give the advice than to always follow it. He texted Isabella that night. "Long day. Wanted to check in." Her response came after a few minutes. "Same. Teresa found 3 more infrastructure issues. She's keeping a running list now, which I find both useful and mildly terrifying. That's what good people do. They find the things you didn't know to look for. Is that what you do? He looked at his phone. I try. You do, she sent back. Thursday still on? Thursday still on. Thursday came and he was in her office by 10, and they were deep in the data architecture by 10:15, and by noon they'd found the root of the problem, and it was both worse and more solvable than he'd expected, which was the way infrastructure problems usually resolved when you actually looked at them without flinching. Isabella called Teresa in, and they spent 2 hours going through it together, the three of them at a whiteboard, and it was one of those afternoons that didn't feel like work in the diminished sense, but in the original sense. The sense of something you put yourself fully into and it gave back more than you put in. At 2 p.m., Teresa left for a call and Nathan and Isabella were alone in the conference room and the whiteboard was covered in diagrams and the coffee had gone cold and neither of them had particularly noticed. He was looking at the board and she was looking at it too, and he said, without entirely planning it, I like Thursdays. She turned to look at him. He gestured at the board, the room. I like this. She held his gaze for a moment. Yeah, she signed. Me too. It's different from Saturdays. Saturdays are ours, she signed. Thursdays are... She paused. Also ours, I think. Just a different kind. He looked at her. The afternoon light came through the windows at that particular November angle that made everything look briefly warmer than it was. And he thought about how many times across the last 6 weeks he'd stored a specific detail. The fairy, the silver light, the way she laughed at the refrigerator magnet story, the clean single nod that was her punctuation. He was storing this one too. Her at the whiteboard in her work clothes, pen in hand, diagram half finished. The warmth of the room, the cold coffee, the board full of solutions they'd found together. I want to tell you something, he said. She waited. I know we haven't... He paused, started over. I'm not trying to put a name on anything. I just want you to know that what's happening here, whatever it is, it matters to me. You matter to me. And I didn't want to let it go unsaid much longer because leaving things unsaid is a habit I'm trying to break. He watched her face move through something. Not surprise exactly. More like recognition, like someone confirming a direction they'd already been moving. I know, she signed. I've known for a while. Is that... He stopped. It's good, she signed, simply. It's very good. He exhaled something he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Okay, he said. Okay, she signed back. The room was quiet. Outside the window, South Lake Union went about its afternoon. Inside the room, 2 people sat with something that had just been said out loud for the first time. And it sat between them without discomfort, without the drama of a declaration, just the specific weight of a true thing finally given air. The infrastructure rebuild is going to take 8 weeks, she signed, picking up her pen and turning back to the board. I want you to help design the approach, properly. Not as someone who's curious about the problem. He looked at her. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you the interesting problem. The job title is negotiable. She looked at him over her shoulder. Think about it. He looked at the whiteboard, then at her. I don't need to think about it, he said. She raised an eyebrow. I'll think about the title, he said. Not the problem. The problem I'm already in. She turned back to the board. He could see the corner of her expression from where he sat, and it was the real smile, the full one, the one that meant something. He picked up his pen. They worked until 5:30, and when he left the building, the November air was cold enough to be actual rather than atmospheric, and the city was doing its evening transition around him, and he walked to his car thinking about load-bearing walls and the ones you could take down, and how sometimes the wall turned out to be a door you'd been standing next to the whole time, just waiting to notice the handle. He didn't sleep badly that night. He slept, for the first time in weeks, with the straightforward ease of a person who had said the true thing and had not been wrong to say it. But what was building quietly in the warmth of what they had found, the Saturdays, the Thursdays, the text threads, and the whiteboard afternoons, and the thing that had finally been given its plain name, was about to meet something it hadn't been tested against yet. Because Kyle Reeves had not, in fact, stopped. And the version of the story he was telling had quietly found its way somewhere Nathan hadn't anticipated. It had found its way to the internet. Nathan found out on a Friday morning, the way people found out about most things now. Not through a conversation, not through someone looking him in the eye and telling him, but through a notification on his phone that arrived while he was making Lily's lunch. It was from Priya. Call me before you go into the office. Not urgent, but also kind of urgent. He read it twice. Priya was not the kind of person who sent messages like that. Priya was the kind of person who either called or didn't, who said what she meant with enough directness that you didn't have to translate the subtext. A message like this from Priya meant something had happened that she wanted him to have context for before he walked into a room that contained it. He finished the sandwich, put it in Lily's lunchbox with the small note he left her every day, a habit he'd started when she began school and hadn't been able to stop because she'd told him once that reading it was the best part of lunch, and you didn't discontinue the best part of lunch, and called Priya from the kitchen while Lily was getting her shoes on. There's a post, Priya said without preamble. Read it. Someone posted it last night. It's in one of the tech gossip subs, the anonymous ones. It's about the coffee thing with Isabella Sterling. Nathan stood very still. What does it say? The story, the whole setup thing, except the version being told it's the Kyle version. You know what I mean. It's framed like a funny story, like a bit. So my colleague didn't know our setup was a deaf billionaire, and you should have seen his face. She paused. Except it's more detailed than that, and it has enough specifics that people in the comments are starting to figure out who she is. Who posted it? The account is anonymous, but it was created 3 days ago and has no other posts. So, Nathan didn't say anything for a moment. How many people have seen it? It had about 300 comments when I looked this morning. It's moving. He looked at the kitchen counter, the sandwich wrapper, the lunchbox with Lily's name written on it in marker in the handwriting she'd chosen herself, which was large and confident and took up more space than strictly necessary. Send me the link, he said. Nathan, please, Priya. She sent it. He got Lily to school. He drove, and she talked from the back seat about the friendship situation that had apparently resolved overnight. She'd texted her friend last night, and the friend had texted back, and they were fine now. It was over. She reported this with the clean satisfaction of a person who had done the hard thing and found it worked. And he listened and responded and asked the right questions. And when he dropped her off, he watched her walk through the school doors with her bag bumping against her back and the particular energy of a 6-year-old who had already solved her main problem before 9 a.m. Then he sat in the car. He opened the link. The post was titled, Deaf Billionaire Setup Goes Hilariously Wrong. Colleague actually knew sign language LMAO. He read it. It was Kyle's voice. He could hear it in the syntax, in the specific details chosen, in the way the whole thing was shaped as entertainment. His name wasn't there. Isabella's name wasn't there. Technically. But the details were specific enough. A deaf female billionaire who'd recently relocated to Seattle, tech sector, founded multiple companies. Anyone who wanted to find her could. And based on the comments, some people already had. The comments were a landscape. Some of them were people laughing. The setup reversal story was genuinely funny as a premise, and absent the actual humans involved, Nathan could see why it landed that way. Some of them were people being kind, saying the guy who knew sign language was decent for knowing it. Some of them were threading together the details and naming companies, naming a person. And some of them were the specific category of internet comment that existed in the space between curiosity and cruelty, the ones that speculated about Isabella, about her life, what her deafness must be like, what her money must look like, what it must be like for someone like her to date someone like the sign language guy. All of it without her consent or knowledge, all of it treating her as material. He put his phone down and drove to work. Marcus was waiting for him at his desk. This was unusual enough that Nathan stopped walking when he saw it. I saw it, Nathan said. I know. I sent it to HR last night the minute I found it. Marcus had the look of a man who hadn't slept well. They're handling it. There's going to be an investigation. If it's Kyle, it's Kyle. I know, but they need to go through the process. He paused. Nathan, I'm sorry. I reported him 2 weeks ago. I thought that was going to be enough. I should have pushed harder. It's not your failure, Nathan said, which was true and also beside the point, because the failure had happened and somebody was going to have to deal with what it had become. Does she know? Marcus looked at him. I don't know. Has she reached out? Nathan checked his phone. Nothing from Isabella. He sat down at his desk. He typed 2 sentences of code and deleted them both. He thought about what Priya had said. People are starting to figure out who she is. And he thought about what Isabella had told him about public attention, about being recognized and reduced to a category, about the particular exhaustion of being seen as a version of yourself that other people had assembled from available data. He thought about her walking into a new city, specifically because San Francisco already knew who she was, because Seattle was still deciding. He picked up his phone and texted her. Have you seen anything online this morning? There's something I need to make sure you know about. He watched the message sit as delivered for 6 minutes. Then the 3 dots appeared. Then, yes. His chest tightened. How long have you known? Just now, he sent back. I found out this morning. I'm sorry. A longer pause this time. Long enough that he set his phone face up on his desk and watched it while not appearing to watch it, which was a specific kind of waiting he hadn't done since the early parenting days when he'd sit next to Lily's crib listening for sounds that would tell him she was okay. Then, can you come today? Not the office, somewhere else. He typed back, where? She sent him an address. It wasn't a cafe. It was, when he looked it up, a small park on the east side of Capitol Hill that he knew in the vague way you knew places in your city you'd passed but never stopped at. Small. Not a tourist location. The kind of place locals used because it was quiet and mostly theirs. He told Marcus he had a personal matter, and he left. The park was exactly what the map suggested. Small, bordered by old trees that had dropped most of their November leaves and left them piled at the edges of the paths in the way Seattle parks had at this time of year. There were 2 or 3 other people in it, all moving, none lingering. He found Isabella on a bench near the far edge, where the trees were thickest and the street noise dropped to something manageable. She was in her coat, her hands in her lap, watching the leaves. She saw him coming and didn't move. He sat down beside her. For a moment, neither of them did anything. He'd been trying on the walk from the car to figure out what to say first, and he'd arrived with nothing that felt right, which turned out to be fine because she started. She signed, "How bad is it?" About 300 comments when I saw it this morning. Moving fast. A few people have named you in the thread. She closed her eyes briefly, not with despair, with the specific expression of someone absorbing a concrete piece of bad news that they'd already suspected but had been hoping to be wrong about. Then she opened them. I found it because my PR person texted me at 7 a.m., she signed. She monitors for mentions. She said it was starting to reach people who cover the accessibility tech space. She paused. Which is my entire professional world right now. Nathan felt the specific weight of that. Not just the personal violation, but the professional dimension. Isabella was in the middle of building a company whose entire foundation was credibility in the deaf and disability communities. She was asking those communities to trust her, to believe she was building something real rather than a performance. And now there was a story circulating that began with her being used as someone else's joke. The story didn't make her look bad, technically, but it made her visible in a context she hadn't chosen, in a narrative she hadn't written, framed by someone who had treated her as entertainment from the start. What did your PR person say to do? He signed. She said, ignore it and it dies. She said, respond and it grows. She said, either way, there are people who are going to write about this for a few days, and there's nothing I can do about that. She looked at her hands. She's probably right. She usually is. But I've spent my whole career building things on the idea that you don't ignore problems. You find them before they compound and you address them directly. She looked at him. Ignoring it feels wrong, like letting someone else write the ending to a story about my life. He thought about what she'd said in October, sitting outside this same city in this same season. I'd rather make the expensive decision now than let it cost me more later. She applied it to infrastructure. She applied it to everything, apparently. It was not an occasional principle. It was how she was built. What would you say? He signed. If you responded. The truth, she signed, immediately. That I was used without my knowledge as part of someone's joke. That the joke failed because the person they targeted was actually decent. And that the story is being told without my permission by someone who still thinks my deafness is the funny part. He looked at her. That's a very specific statement, he signed. Yes, it'll be picked up everywhere. Yes, it'll escalate. I know. She looked at him directly. But it'll be true, and it'll be mine. And no one else gets to tell my story without that being on the record. He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the park did its quiet November things. A squirrel moving through the leaf piles, the sound of traffic at a distance, the specific gray quality of the sky that meant rain was considering its options. Do you want my opinion? He signed. Yes. That's why I asked you here instead of calling Teresa. He thought about it properly, the way he thought about infrastructure problems, following the logic, finding where it held and where it didn't, looking for the thing underneath the surface thing. Your PR person is right that responding feeds it, he signed. But you're right that silence seeds the narrative. I think there's a version that does both, responds but on your own terms and in your own time. Not reactive, deliberate. He paused. You're launching a company that's specifically about not letting deaf people be spoken for by other people. If there was ever a moment where your personal story and your professional story are the same story, this might be it. She looked at him for a long time. That's either very smart or very risky, she signed. It's probably both. She laughed, short, somewhat surprised, the way she laughed when something caught her off guard. And then the laugh settled and she was quiet for a moment and he watched her working through it, the real calculation, the one that required her to sit with the discomfort of visibility and decide what to do with it. Let me think about it, she signed. Of course. Thank you for coming. She looked at him. I mean it. I know you left work. I know you know. He held her gaze. That's not why you're thanking me. She looked at him steadily. No, she signed. I'm thanking you because you got here fast and you didn't try to fix it before I told you what I needed. He nodded once. That's something I had to learn, he signed. I used to try to fix things before I understood them. It was a problem. Past tense? Mostly past tense, he admitted. Work in progress. She almost smiled. The almost smile from the first morning, the one he'd learned was not a lesser version of the real one, but a different one, for different moments. He'd learned the whole vocabulary of her expressions across 10 weeks, without setting out to, the way you learned the grammar of a place when you lived in it long enough to stop being a visitor. They sat there for a while longer, not talking. Just two people in a park in November, with a problem between them and enough trust to let it sit without filling the space around it. Eventually, she pulled her coat tighter and stood. I'll call you tonight, she signed. I'll be home by 6. She nodded, turned to go, then stopped and turned back. Nathan. She looked at him directly, the way she did when she was about to say something she'd decided to mean. The person who posted that, he thought the story was about him. His plan, his joke, his big reveal. She paused. I've been thinking about it since 7 a.m., and I can't find a single version of it where he's the important part. Can you? Nathan looked at her. No, he signed. She nodded once, the period nod, and turned and walked out of the park, and he watched her go and then sat there for a few more minutes looking at the trees. He called Priya on the walk back to his car. I need to know everything that happened between Marcus going to HR and right now, he said. Priya laid it out efficiently, the way she laid everything out. HR had opened a formal investigation. Kyle had been called in that morning. The anonymous account had been reported to the platform. The post itself was under review. The process would take time. These things always took time. And the time was part of why they were frustrating, because the thing causing harm didn't wait for the process. Did Kyle say anything? Nathan asked. He said the account wasn't his, Priya said, which is what you'd say either way, so. Right. Nathan, she paused. I want you to know something. I thought the whole setup was wrong from the beginning. I should have said so out loud before it happened instead of just being privately uncomfortable with it. I didn't, and I've been sitting with that. He stopped walking. Priya, I'm serious. I could have shut it down at the planning stage. I didn't. You didn't design it. No, but I knew it was coming and I said nothing. Her voice was even, the way it was when she was being precise about something. I'm telling you because I think you deserve to know that I was a bystander in that, and I don't think bystanders get to walk away clean. He stood on the sidewalk in the November cold and thought about what it took to say that, to look at your own failure without dressing it up. Okay, he said, I appreciate that. How is she? She's thinking, he said. She's going to be okay. He found the word. She's not someone who breaks easily. No, Priya said. She didn't look like that. He drove back to the office and spent the afternoon doing actual work, which was both harder and more necessary than he expected. The code didn't care about any of it, which was occasionally the most useful thing about code. It demanded exactly what it demanded and accepted exactly what you gave it, no more and no less. And right now that specificity was something he could inhabit cleanly. At 5:15, an email arrived from HR. It was addressed to the team, which meant it had gone to everyone. It said, in the measured language HR emails always used, that a conduct matter was under active review and that anyone with relevant information was encouraged to contact the HR department directly. It said that the company took professional conduct seriously and that outcomes would be communicated through appropriate channels. Nathan read it once and closed it. At 5:45, Kyle left the office with a box. Nathan didn't see it directly. He heard it. The specific social shift of an open-plan office when something significant is happening. The way ambient noise adjusted and eye contact redistributed. He looked up once and saw Kyle at the elevator with the kind of small cardboard box that meant a desk had been cleared, and Kyle looked at nothing in particular with the expression of someone walking through a moment they weren't ready to be in. Nathan looked back at his screen. He didn't feel satisfied. He'd expected to feel something cleaner than what he felt, which was just a kind of tired acknowledgement. This had always been where the thing was going, and now it had gotten there, and the getting there didn't undo anything that had happened, it just meant the happening was finished. He packed up and drove to get Lily. She was in the middle of a drawing when he got there. She was always in the middle of something, and she finished it with the focus of a person who was not going to be interrupted by something as minor as being picked up, and then she held it up for him to see. It was, she explained, a landscape of feelings, part 2. The sequel. What's in this one? He asked. She pointed to various parts with the authority of a curator. This is the part where something's wrong, but you don't know what yet. This is the part where you figure it out. This is the part after. He looked at the drawing. Lily's art didn't look like any of those things literally, but it also somehow looked like exactly those things. I really like this one, he said. I know, she said, and took his hand and they walked to the car. Isabella called at 7:30 after Lily was in bed. Not a text? A video call, because it was the only way they could sign to each other at distance. The same adaptation he'd had with Raymond his whole adult life. The phone as a window rather than a wire. She looked composed. Not in the suppressed way of someone holding something down, but in the actual way of someone who had spent the day sitting with something difficult and had arrived on the other side of it with a decision. I talked to Teresa, she signed, and my PR person, and my lawyer. And? I'm going to write something, not a response to the post. That's not what it is. It's a statement, but the kind you put on your own platform. Our company blog, actually. She looked at him. The story of what happened, my version, why it matters for a company like ours, why the specific thing that was supposed to make the joke work, my deafness, the assumption that it was a barrier, is exactly the assumption we're building this company to dismantle. She paused. Teresa says it's either the bravest thing I've ever done professionally or the stupidest. What do you think? I think it's probably both, she signed, which was what he'd said to her in the park that morning, and the echo of it was deliberate. He could see that. When? Monday. I'm writing it this weekend. I want to sit with it before I publish. She looked at him steadily. I want you to read it before I publish, if that's okay. Something in his chest moved, not dramatically, just the specific weight of being asked to hold something that mattered. Of course, he said. I'm not asking you to approve it, she signed quickly. I know what I want to say. I just want... She paused. I want you to read it. Because you were there, because the thing it's about involves you too, and because your opinion matters to me and I'm done pretending it doesn't just to seem more independent than I actually am. He looked at her on the screen, her face in the slightly flat light of whatever room she was in. Her apartment, he'd never been. He knew it only as the background of these video calls, bookshelves, and a good lamp. And he thought about what she'd just given him. Not just the ask, the explanation for the ask. The specific admission that she cared what he thought and that the caring was not a weakness she needed to manage. Send it to me when it's ready, he said. She nodded. How are you? He signed, not as a filler, as an actual question. She thought about it for a moment, which was something she did when she was taking a question seriously rather than reaching for the standard answer. Angry, she signed. Still angry, but not at the situation anymore. At what it represents. At the fact that this specific assumption, that my deafness is an obstacle or a punchline or a thing to be navigated, is the assumption I'm trying to build a company against, and it keeps showing up in my own life like it's trying to make the point for me. Maybe it is, he said. She looked at him. What do you mean? I mean, he thought about how to say it. You're building something specifically to change the way systems treat deaf people. And the universe, or whatever you want to call it, keeps handing you examples of exactly the problem you're solving. Maybe that's not irony. Maybe that's material. She was quiet for a moment. Raymond would like you, he added. Your uncle? He has the same thing you do, the ability to take the thing that's causing problems and turn it into the reason to do the work. He paused. I called him a few weeks ago, actually. I told him about you. She looked at him, and the expression that moved across her face was the open one, the unguarded one, the one he'd first seen when he'd mentioned Raymond in the very first weeks, the one that showed up when something landed in a place she hadn't expected. What did he say? She signed. He said you sounded like someone worth knowing. That's a modest assessment. Raymond is a modest person. He means more than he says. She held his gaze through the screen for a long moment. Tell him thank you, she signed. Tell him yourself sometime, he said, and let it sit there, the implication of it, the future it casually assumed. She didn't pull back from it. Okay, she signed. They talked for another hour, not about Kyle, not about the post, not about the statement she was going to write, about other things, about a book she'd been reading that had made her think about the way cities were designed for sound rather than sight, about Lily's art, which he'd photographed and sent her weeks ago, the landscape of feelings that Lily had given him permission to share, about a problem Nathan had been turning over at work that had nothing to do with any of this, but that he'd been stuck on and that, in explaining it to her, he'd partially solved, which kept happening, this effect she had on his thinking, where articulating something clearly for her made it clearer for him. At 9 o'clock, he said he should sleep because Lily had a thing tomorrow morning that required him to be functional. What kind of thing? She signed. A school event. There's a harvest festival, and she has been preparing a presentation on the water cycle that I was informed is very accurate. Of course it is. She's been practicing on me. I know more about the water cycle than I did a month ago. What's the most interesting thing you learned? He thought about it. That the water on Earth has been recycled so many times that statistically you've definitely drunk water that passed through a dinosaur. Isabella stared at him. That is the single best fact I've learned this year. Lily thought so too. She shook her head slowly with an expression that was equal parts amusement and genuine appreciation. She's going to change things, that kid. I know, he said. I'm just trying to keep up. They signed off. He put his phone on the charger and turned off the kitchen light and stood in his apartment in the particular quiet of late evening, different from the weighted silence of the lilyless weekends. This was the quiet of a house where someone was asleep and the sleeping was peaceful. He thought about what she'd said. I'm done pretending it doesn't just to seem more independent than I actually am. He filed that alongside the other true things she'd said across the weeks, the ones he kept without meaning to. He thought about Monday and the statement she was going to publish, and the specific courage it took to say, this is my story and I'm telling it myself. He thought about what Lily had said. The people you like should see where you live. He'd been inside Isabella's office, inside her thinking, inside the architecture of what she was building. He'd been in a park with her in November while she was deciding what to do with something painful. He'd been in this specific intimacy of knowing someone's mind from the inside. He hadn't brought her home yet. He thought it might be time. He didn't know exactly how to arrange it. He'd need to talk to Lily, who was perceptive enough to have opinions and young enough to have them without filter. That required its own conversation, its own care. You didn't just introduce a 6-year-old to someone who mattered without giving the 6-year-old adequate context and respect for the complexity of the thing. But he thought it might be time. He went to bed thinking about it, and about Monday, and about the statement that was going to go out into the world carrying Isabella's name and her voice and the truth of what had happened to her, and how the internet that had passed the joke around like a commodity was going to encounter the actual person the joke had been about. He thought Kyle, wherever he was tonight, didn't know what was coming. And he thought Isabella Sterling, sitting somewhere in her apartment over a blank document that was about to become something, knew exactly what she was doing. He turned off the light. He slept well. Isabella sent him the draft on Sunday morning at 11:47. No message with it. Just the document link, which was its own kind of trust. She wasn't framing it, wasn't pre-explaining what he was about to read, wasn't cushioning it with qualifications. She was just handing it to him and letting it be what it was. He read it at the kitchen table while Lily watched a documentary about ocean creatures in the other room, the sound of it drifting through. Something about deep-sea fish that produce their own light, which Lily had selected with the focused intentionality she brought to all media choices. He could hear her occasional commentary directed at the television, which was a habit she'd developed and which he'd decided was fine, possibly even healthy. The piece was 6 paragraphs long, not short, but not long either. It had the quality of something that had been through many drafts without losing the feeling of a single clear voice, which was the hardest thing to do in writing, he thought, to revise without sanding away the person. She'd titled it, "My Name is Not the Punchline." He read it through once fast, the way you read something when you're anxious about it. Then he went back to the beginning and read it properly. She told the story plainly. She said she'd been invited to meet people in a new city under false pretenses, that her deafness had been the specific premise of a joke, that she'd walked into a room not knowing 5 people were waiting for her to be someone's entertainment. She said this without drama, without performing injury, with the same matter-of-fact precision she used in meetings. Then she wrote the thing that stopped him. She wrote, "What I want people to understand is not that the setup was cruel, though it was. It's that this kind of thing, using disability as the hinge of a joke, assuming that deafness is a problem that others have to navigate rather than a language and a life that I inhabit fully, is not exceptional. It is ordinary. It happens in boardrooms and on first meetings, and in the specific way people slow down and over-enunciate when they want to feel helpful. The joke failed for a simple reason. The person sitting across from me hadn't built his assumptions about me before he met me. He simply sat down and said hello. In sign language. And that turned out to be enough to make the whole thing fall apart. I'm building a company on that principle, that when you stop assuming and start building for people as they actually are, things work better. Not just for the people who were left out, for everyone. Because the version of the world you get when you genuinely include everyone is more interesting, more functional, and more honest than the one you get when you build for the center and hope everyone else adapts. The post that circulated this week told my story without my permission. I'm taking it back. Not because I'm angry, though I am, but because the story is actually a useful one, not as entertainment, as evidence. He set his phone down. In the other room, Lily said to the television, "You make your own light? That's so smart." Nathan sat at the kitchen table for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and typed, "It's good. It's really good. Don't change anything." Her response came within 2 minutes. "Are you sure about the last paragraph? Teresa thinks it's too direct. Teresa is wrong. The directness is the point. If you soften it, it becomes a statement. The way it is, it's an argument." A pause. "Okay," she sent back. Monday morning." "Monday morning," he confirmed. He put the phone in his pocket and went to the living room doorway. Lily was on the couch in the specific configuration she adopted for serious viewing, sideways, feet up, chin resting on the armrest, and she looked up when she heard him. "Did you know," she said, "that some fish make their own light in the dark?" "I did not know that," he said, which was not entirely true but was the right answer. "It's called bio something." She frowned. "Bioluminescence," she said, trying the word out in syllables. "It means you don't need anyone else to light up your part of the ocean." He looked at his daughter. "That's a good way to think about it," he said. She turned back to the documentary. He went back to the kitchen to start lunch. He spent the rest of Sunday thinking about how to have the conversation with Lily. Not because he was afraid of it. He'd learned across 6 years of solo parenting that the conversations he avoided for fear of her reaction were usually the ones she handled better than he expected, and the ones he rushed were the ones that came back complicated. He wanted to find the right entry point, not an announcement, not something that required her to perform a reaction, just a conversation. It came, as conversations with Lily usually did, from her rather than from him. Sunday evening, she was at the kitchen counter again while he cooked. The position she'd stopped being allowed to occupy and then been allowed to occupy again by a kind of mutual silent agreement. And she said, without looking up from the drawing she was working on, "Is your friend coming over soon?" He looked up. "What made you think of that?" "I didn't think of it. I've been wondering for weeks." She looked at him with the expression she used when she found adult avoidance mildly inefficient. "You've been going out on Saturdays and sometimes Thursdays. You text someone and then you look like you do when you solved a hard problem at work." "I look like something when I solve a hard problem?" "You look like you but more," she said, which was so specific and so accurate that he didn't know what to do with it. "Her name is Isabella," he said. Lily picked a new color. "I know, you said that. She's someone I care about, someone who's become important to me." He paused. "I wanted to make sure I said that to you properly before anything else." Lily was quiet for a moment, coloring. "Is she nice?" she said. "Yes. She's also direct and funny, and she builds things, and she has very strong opinions about systems that don't work the way they should." Lily looked up. "Like me. A little bit like you, yes." She thought about this. "She's deaf," she said. Not a question. He blinked. "How do you know that?" "You sign when you text her. I can see your hands doing small signs when you read her messages, like you're reading with your hands." She said this with the matter-of-fact observation of someone reporting a thing they'd noticed weeks ago and had been waiting to mention. "I looked up some signs. I know how to say hello, and I know how to say my name, and I know how to say I like your sweater because I thought that was useful." Nathan set down the wooden spoon. "Lily," he said. "What?" He didn't have a word for what he felt. It was in the category of things that arrived without warning and required you to just stand in them. "That was a very thoughtful thing to do," he said. She shrugged, the small-shouldered shrug she did when she was pleased but wasn't going to say so. "I wanted to be able to talk to her. If she comes over." She looked at him. "Is she going to come over?" "I'd like to ask her, if that's okay with you." Lily considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Okay," she said. "But can it be a dinner?" "Not just coffee. Coffee is short. Dinner is enough time to actually talk to someone." "You're 6. "I know." She returned to her drawing. "Dinner," she said again, a settled conclusion. He turned back to the stove. He was smiling at the wall, which was something that happened around both of them apparently, this ambushing of his own face by things he hadn't planned to feel. He texted Isabella that evening. "Lily wants to know if you'll come for dinner." Then, before she could respond, "And she already knows a few signs." She looked them up herself. The 3 dots appeared and disappeared twice. Then, Nathan. Just his name. He waited. "I'm going to need a minute." He smiled at his phone. "Take your time," he sent back. Her response came 4 minutes later. "Tell Lily yes, and tell her I know how to sign 'I like your sweater' too, and I look forward to comparing notes." He laughed out loud, alone in his kitchen, which was becoming a habit. Monday arrived with the particular anticipatory energy of a day that was going to contain something. Nathan was at his desk by 8, which was earlier than most, and he spent the first hour doing real work. A focused, productive hour that had the quality of doing something normal in the minutes before something significant. The way you made coffee on a hard morning because the making of coffee was something you could control. At 9:15, Isabella published the piece. He knew because his phone buzzed with a text from Teresa. It's live, bracing. He opened the company blog and read it again, this time knowing it was out in the world. It read differently that way. Not the document he'd reviewed as a trusted reader, but a public thing now, with all the exposure that implied. He thought about how that felt for her, the specific vulnerability of saying a true thing out loud where anyone could reach it. He texted her, "It's up. How do you feel?" She took a few minutes to respond, which meant she was probably at her desk watching the early numbers come in. Like I jumped off something and I'm waiting to find out if there's water below. There's water, he sent back. You don't know that. No. But you built a good argument. Good arguments land. Another pause. Teresa is refreshing the analytics every 30 seconds. I've told her to stop. She has not stopped. He smiled. Let her. It's how she handles anxiety. I know. I'm doing the same thing but with more dignity. Sure, he sent back. He put his phone away and worked. By noon, the piece had been shared by 3 major accounts in the accessibility and disability advocacy space. By 2 p.m., a journalist from a technology publication that covered deaf and disability issues had emailed the company asking for a comment, which, Teresa texted Nathan with 3 exclamation points, was the good kind of journalist reaching out, not the bad kind. By end of business, the piece had been read enough times that it had left the specific gravity of the original Reddit post somewhere behind, and the story that was circulating was no longer Kyle's version. It was Isabella's. Nathan was packing up his desk when Marcus appeared. He looked like a man who'd spent the day watching something he'd partially caused resolve in a direction better than he deserved. I read it, Marcus said. Yeah. She's... He stopped. Started again. The way she wrote about the person who sat down and just said hello. He looked at Nathan. She was talking about you. I know. It made me think about what I could have done differently. At the start. He looked at the floor. I've been thinking about it for weeks. I keep arriving at the same place. I should have said no to Kyle before any of it happened, and I didn't because saying no would have required a confrontation I wasn't in the mood for. He looked up. That's the honest version. Not that I didn't know. I knew. I just didn't want the argument. Nathan looked at him. I know, he said. I'm sorry. For real. I believe you. He picked up his bag. Marcus, you went to HR. You told the truth when they asked. You've been saying the right things since this started. That matters. He paused. It doesn't undo the beginning, but it matters. Marcus nodded, something in him visibly accepting that, not absolved, but heard. She sounds like someone worth knowing, Marcus said. She is, Nathan said. She really is. He drove to get Lily. The week moved. The piece continued to travel, not virally in the algorithmic explosion sense, but steadily, the way good arguments moved when they found the audiences they were written for. Accessibility advocates shared it. Companies that worked in the disability space shared it. 3 separate journalists wrote about it, mostly in the framing of what it meant for the company Isabella was building, which was exactly the reframe she'd been reaching for. A few comments were unkind, babe. There were always a few, but they were outnumbered and they didn't have the structure of an argument, just the volume of people who felt entitled to react. The Reddit post that had started everything sank into the archive, overtaken by the response to it, which was the specific internet irony of something mean becoming the foundation of something better. Kyle did not come back to the office. Nathan didn't know the full details. HR wasn't in the habit of sharing those, and he didn't ask because the outcome had been clear from the box under Kyle's arm on Friday evening. What he knew was that Kyle was gone, and that the story he'd thought was about his cleverness had ended up being about something else entirely, and that somewhere in that was a lesson Nathan didn't need to articulate to know was true. Some jokes had a direction they thought they were going, and a direction they actually went. Isabella came to dinner on a Saturday, 3 weeks after the piece went live. He'd told Lily on Wednesday, which gave Lily 3 days to prepare, which she used to practice her signs with an intensity that Nathan found both admirable and slightly alarming. She'd moved well past hello and her name and I like your sweater. By Friday, she could sign, what's your favorite color? Do you like dogs? My name is Lily, and I'm 6.5. The half was important. She'd been very specific about including it. He'd also cleaned the apartment with more thoroughness than its usual standard, which Lily observed and commented on by saying, you're nervous, with the diagnostic certainty of a very small doctor. And he'd said he wasn't, and she'd looked at him and said nothing further, which was the most effective response available. Isabella arrived at 6:15 with a canvas tote, the same kind she always carried, not the designer version, just a bag, that turned out to contain a small cactus in a terracotta pot and a tin of cookies from a bakery near her apartment. I didn't know what to bring, she signed when he opened the door. I asked Teresa. She said plants and sugar were universally appropriate. Teresa's right, he said. Come in. She came in and looked at the apartment with the attentiveness she brought to spaces, reading it, seeing how it was built, what it said about the person who'd made it. He watched her take it in. The bookshelves that were half his and half Lily's, the art on the walls that was exactly 50% gallery prints and 50% Lily's drawings because Lily had negotiated this distribution with the seriousness of a union rep. The kitchen that was clean but visibly used, with the small magnetic letters on the fridge arranged in the current configuration of the system Nathan didn't understand but didn't disturb. Then Lily appeared in the hallway. She was wearing the sweater she'd picked for Nathan the first Saturday. She'd borrowed it some weeks ago and it reached her knees. And she walked up to Isabella with the directness she brought to everything and signed carefully with the slight over-precision of someone who'd been practicing. Hello. My name is Lily. I am 6.5. Isabella's face did something that Nathan was going to remember for a long time. Not surprise exactly, though that was there, the genuine caught off guard of it, but something underneath the surprise, the deeper layer, the one that showed up when something reached past the managed exterior to the place that wasn't managing anything. She crouched down to Lily's level. She signed back, slowly and clearly. Hello, Lily. My name is Isabella. I am 30.5. She paused. The half is important. Lily's face broke into a grin of pure, unmanaged delight. She said the half, she announced to the room at large, as if Nathan might have missed it. She signed again. Do you like dogs? Isabella signed. Very much. Do you have one? Lily looked at Nathan with sudden intensity. We should get a dog, she said. We've talked about the dog. We should talk about it again. Maybe later, he said. Lily turned back to Isabella with the fluid subject changing of someone who'd made her point and was willing to let it marinate. She signed. What is your favorite color? Green, Isabella signed back. Like your sweater. Lily looked down at the sweater, Nathan's sweater, and then back up with an expression of deep satisfaction. I picked that sweater, she said, and signed it simultaneously with the slight imprecision of someone doing two things at once. Isabella looked at Nathan. She picked your sweater? First time we met, he signed. She said it made me look like a park. Isabella looked at Lily, then at Nathan. Then she laughed. The real one, the full one, the one he'd first seen at the table in Anchor and Grounds when he'd said something that caught her genuinely off guard, and the laugh was the same now as it had been then. Unguarded and bright, and taking up exactly as much space as it needed to. Lily looked pleased in the deep, specific way she looked when she'd caused something good. Dinner was lamb chops because Lily had requested something fancy enough to matter, and Nathan had landed on that as fitting the criterion. He cooked while Isabella sat at the kitchen counter, the same place Lily sat, which he noticed, and they talked and signed, and Lily moved between the kitchen and the living room, collecting things to show Isabella. The current landscape of feelings, an interesting rock she'd found on the walk home from school, the chapter book she was reading that was, she said, very intense right now. Isabella received each of these with full attention, looking at them properly, asking real questions. Not the polite adult version of interest, but actual interest, the kind Lily could always detect and ruthlessly distinguished from its imitation. She's testing you, Nathan signed to Isabella when Lily went back to her room for something. I know, Isabella signed back. I'm passing. You sound certain. I am certain. She picked up her glass.
She asked me about the rock. Not, "That's a nice rock." She actually asked where I thought it came from and whether I thought it was igneous or sedimentary. I said I didn't know, but that the texture suggested it had been in water a long time. She looked at him. She told me I was probably right. He shook his head slowly. "What do you do with a kid like that?" "You keep up," she signed. "The way you keep saying." Dinner was loud in the way dinners with Lily were loud. She occupied a space conversationally the way she occupied it physically, fully and without apology. She had things she wanted to talk about, and she talked about them. She also, at several points across the meal, signed directly to Isabella. The signs she'd practiced mixed with new ones she figured out by watching Nathan, which was how he'd learned too, watching Raymond across the table as a child, picking up the grammar of a language by living near it.
At one point, Lily said something and signed something slightly different simultaneously, and Isabella caught the discrepancy between the spoken words and the signed ones and gently showed her how they aligned, her hands patient and clear, and Lily watched with the total absorption she brought to things she wanted to know. And then she tried it again, and when she got it right, she looked up at Isabella with the expression she used when she'd just acquired something new and was already planning how to use it. After dinner, Lily was allowed 30 minutes of reading in her room before bed. This was non-negotiable. She accepted it tonight with less negotiation than usual, which meant she'd gotten enough of what she'd come to the table wanting. She did stop in the doorway on her way out. She looked at Isabella. "Good night," she signed, careful and deliberate. Isabella signed back. "Good night, Lily." And then, with the specific impulsiveness of a 6.5-year-old who had decided something and was acting on it before the decision could be questioned, Lily crossed back to the table and hugged Isabella briefly around the shoulders, the side hug of a child who was expressing affection without making it a big thing, and then went to her room. Isabella sat very still for a moment. Nathan looked at her. Her expression was the unguarded one, the open one. Not crying. She wasn't the kind of person who cried easily, and he knew this. But something close to the place tears came from. Something that looked like being unexpectedly moved and not having prepared a face for it. She looked at him. "She's something else," she signed. "Yeah," he said. "How did you make a person like that?" "I don't know. I think she mostly made herself." He picked up the water glasses. "I just tried not to get in the way." He washed the dishes. She sat at the counter, and they talked in the comfortable way of people who didn't need to fill silence, but chose to fill it anyway because they liked the filling. They talked about the company. The infrastructure rebuild was 2 months in and ahead of schedule, which Teresa reported weekly with the satisfaction of a person who'd built the timeline and was now watching it hold. They talked about an offer that had come in that week from a firm that wanted to partner on expanding the platform nationally, which was 3 months earlier than Isabella had projected, and had required her to spend 2 days deciding whether the timeline was right or whether the speed was its own kind of pressure. "What did you decide?" Nathan asked. "Not yet," she signed. "The money is good. The terms are manageable. But the reason I started this company was to build it right, and right doesn't always move as fast as possible." She looked at him. "I'd rather be a year behind my own projections than 6 months ahead of my readiness." Raymond said something like that once, about a chess opening. He thought about it. He said the temptation in the early game is to move fast because you can, but the games that were decided in the opening were usually decided by the person who moved slower. She looked at him. "Your uncle teaches chess and also life philosophy simultaneously. He doesn't think he's doing the second part. That's what makes it work." She smiled. "I'd like to meet him," she signed. The same echo of what she'd said weeks ago, "Okay, tell him yourself sometime," returned now, deliberate and easy, the way she did things. "He's coming for Christmas," Nathan said. "Lily invited him approximately 6 weeks ago. She mailed him an actual letter." She mailed a letter. She felt email was insufficiently formal for an invitation. Isabella looked at the middle distance for a moment, with an expression that was navigating some complex emotion with characteristic efficiency. Then she looked back at him. "That child is going to run something someday." "I know," he said. "I'm already slightly afraid." "You should be," she signed. "Prepare accordingly." He laughed. They moved to the living room because the kitchen stools were not built for long evenings and the couch was. The lamp was on, the good one, the warm one that Lily had selected when Nathan had made the mistake of taking her to a lighting store and giving her input. They sat not quite with the formality of two people sitting at opposite ends of a couch, which was a detail that registered without either of them remarking on it. "Can I ask you something?" Nathan said. She looked at him. "Go ahead." "The night you decided to write the piece, before you talked to Teresa or your PR person or your lawyer, what was the moment you decided?" She was quiet for a moment, not evasive, thinking. There was a comment in the thread she signed, not a mean one. Someone who seemed to mean well. They were speculating about what my life was like, what I must experience, what it must be like to be me. She paused. They weren't being cruel, but they were writing about me like I was a hypothetical, like I was a thought experiment rather than a person sitting somewhere reading what they'd written. She looked at her hands, and I thought, you don't get to do that. You don't get to imagine me. I'm right here. I'll tell you myself. Nathan held her gaze. That's the whole company, he said. In a story. Yes, she signed. I know. I think that's why I had to write it. It wasn't just about what happened to me. It was about the reason I do the work. She looked at him. The joke was supposed to be about my deafness, and the response to the joke is also about my deafness. But the thing I want people to leave with is that I'm not a story about deafness. I'm a person who happens to be deaf. The same way Lily is not a story about being 6.5. She's a person who happens to be 6.5. He thought about what she'd said in the park. The person who designed it thought he was the important part. And she'd been right. Kyle had thought the story was his, and the story had turned out to be hers, and everything it contained and the thing it had produced. I have something to tell you, he said. She waited. I've been offered a position, he said. I'm not at my current company. Somewhere else. He paused. A company that specifically works on accessible technology infrastructure. They reached out last week. Someone who'd read about all of this. Who knew I'd been doing consulting work at your company? They want someone to lead their infrastructure team. She looked at him. What did you say? I said I needed to think about it. And I'm telling you because... He stopped. Started again, more honestly. Because you're part of how I think about things now. And I didn't want to make a decision this significant without telling you it existed. She was quiet for a long moment. Not performing consideration, actually in it, the way she was in problems she took seriously. Do you want it? She signed. The work is interesting. The mission is something I believe in. The pay is a lateral move. He looked at her. And it's not your company, which matters to me. I don't want what we have to be tangled up in what you're building to the point where one puts pressure on the other. She held his gaze. That's a very careful way to think about it, she signed. I've had practice being careful about important things. Your daughter. Among other things. He held her gaze. More recently. She looked at him with the direct openness she had when she'd stopped managing impressions, when she was just looking at him as the thing he was, rather than the version of it that was easier to hold. Take the job, she signed. Yeah? You just described every reason to take it except one. And the one you didn't say is that you're worried about what it means for us. She tilted her head. So I'll tell you what it means. It means you'll be doing work you believe in at a company that didn't originate in a cafe setup. It means you won't be consulting at mine, which, as you said, matters. And it means... She paused. We have our own thing, Nathan. It's not built on professional proximity or shared infrastructure problems. It's built on Saturday mornings and honest conversations and a 6-year-old who mailed a letter. She looked at him steadily. That holds? He looked at her. You're certain, he said. I'm certain, she signed. He exhaled, and in the exhale was something he'd been holding without knowing it. The weight of trying to protect something by not moving it, and the relief of learning it could take more movement than he'd feared. Okay, he said. Tell me what the work is, she signed, the actual problem they need you to solve. So he told her, and she listened and asked the sharp question she always asked, and by the end of it he understood what he was walking into better than he had before he started explaining it to her, which was still consistently, the effect she had. It was close to 10 when she left. Lily had been asleep for an hour and a half. The apartment was quiet, in the particular way of a house where good things had happened and their residue was still in the air. At the door, she pulled her coat on and picked up the canvas tote. He'd given back the cookies, she'd left the cactus, which sat now on his kitchen counter like a declaration of return. She signed, "Tell Lily she's a very good signer for someone who taught herself in 3 days." "I will," he said. "She'll add it to her list of accomplishments." "She should." She looked at him. "This was good." "Yeah," he said. "It was." She looked at him for a moment in the particular way of someone who was deciding something and then deciding it. Then she stepped forward and kissed him. Not the exploratory kind, not the tentative kind, but the kind that knew what it was doing, brief and deliberate, like a period at the end of a sentence she'd already finished writing. She stepped back. Her expression was steady. "Good night," she signed. "Good night," he said. She walked down the hallway and he watched her go, and then closed the door and stood in his apartment that smelled like dinner and had a cactus on the counter and a child asleep in the back room and the warm specific residue of an evening that had gone, without perfection, exactly right. He sat down on the couch. He thought about an 8-year-old who'd looked across a dinner table and decided that the distance between himself and the person he wanted to talk to was a problem with a solution, and that the solution was learning the language. That had been 24 years ago, and he'd mostly forgotten. And then he'd walked into a cafe on a Saturday morning expecting a brief, awkward social obligation and walked out with something he hadn't planned for. The thing about the honest version of any story, he thought, was that it was never clean. It had a cruel setup and a coworker who made a box-under-the-arm exit and a Reddit post and a park bench in November and a piece of writing that said, "I'm right here, I'll tell you myself." It had a 6-year-old who looked up signs because she wanted to talk to someone before she'd met them. It had a man who'd stopped in a parking lot, and a man who'd spent a lifetime navigating rooms that weren't built for him, and a woman who'd decided to build different rooms. It had a cactus on a kitchen counter. These were not the ingredients of a clean story. They were the ingredients of a real one. He reached for his phone and texted Raymond. "She came for dinner tonight." Lily signed to her. "I'm taking a new job. And I think you should come for Christmas early if you can. There are people here you should meet." Raymond responded in 11 minutes. It was late in Portland, but Raymond had always been a night person. "I'll drive up the 20th, Raymond sent. "Do I need to bring the chess set, or are you finally ready to admit you don't want to play chess? You just want an excuse to sit with me for 2 hours? Nathan smiled at his phone. "Bring it anyway," he sent back. "Lily wants to learn." "Of course she does," Raymond replied, and Nathan could hear the dry warmth of him in it, all the way from Portland, the same warmth that had been across every dinner table of his childhood, the constant, reliable thing. He put his phone on the charger. He sat there for a little longer in the quiet apartment, not because he needed to sit with anything difficult, but because the moment was the kind that deserved not to be rushed past. The cactus on the counter, the fridge with the magnet system he didn't understand, the drawings on the walls, the life he'd built out of the materials available to him, imperfect and functional and his. He thought about what Isabella had written. When you stop assuming and start building for people as they actually are, things work better. He thought she was right, not just about companies, about all of it. He'd been building for a while now, 6.5 years with Lily, 9 years in Seattle, 24 years since he'd sat across from Raymond at a dinner table and decided the distance was fixable. He'd made mistakes in the building, not the dramatic kind, mostly the ordinary kind, the things you did when you were tired or afraid or too stubborn to adjust. But he'd kept building, and the building had brought him here, to this apartment on this evening with the warm lamp on and the residue of something good and a message sent north that said, "Come early, there are people you should meet." Not a clean ending, not a perfect one. Just the place in the story where enough had been built that you could stand in it and see what it was becoming. He turned off the lamp. He went to bed. Outside, Seattle continued being Seattle. The night rain on the windows, the distant sound of the city doing its overnight things. The particular quiet that came after 10 p.m. in a residential neighborhood, which was less quiet than silence and more quiet than noise, which was its own kind of right. He slept. And in the morning, Lily would tell him she'd dreamed about bioluminescent fish
and he would make breakfast, and the cactus would be on the counter where Isabella had left it, and the day would be ordinary in the way that days were ordinary when your life had found a shape that fit. Not the shape you'd planned, not the one you'd expected, but the one that turned out, when you were finally standing in it, to be exactly large enough